Hi, Matt here in the Hawkwind editing studio, or bedroom as it's more commonly known. Before we begin, a little note on the sound quality towards the back third of this episode. For reasons that will become evident, this podcast was recorded in 2 parts, and unbeknownst to us, the second recording went a bit weird. So if you hear a distinct difference in audio quality an hour or so in, it's not you, it's us, and it shouldn't happen again. But we've kept you waiting long enough for this episode, so here it is.
Technicians of Spaceship Earth, welcome to Hawkbinge, your guide to the chaos planes of the multiverse that is the Hawkwind discography, one album at a time, in the company of a long-time fan, which is me, and your favourite first-time listener, who is Matt. Matt, hello, how are you?
I'm good, thank you, Andy. I think I am responsible for the late running of this episode, and one of the reasons that happened is because I am no longer in New York. In between the last 2 episodes, I was offered a job in Berlin, so I have up sticks, put everything in a big case, and have shipped it across the world.
Outstanding. It feels like we're neighbours again.
It does. It's nice to be back in Europe. I mean, it's cold and it gets dark at 4 p.m. But it is nice to be not in such a massive time sink.
Yes.
The late running of the show is just because right now I'm in a borrowed apartment while I wait for all my stuff to arrive, just talking to a laptop rather than my nice snuggly microphone, which I've been coveting for the last few episodes. So if I sound weird, that's why.
I was thinking about how long it seems to now take us to record each episode, and I remembered that the first season was done largely in lockdown, and also that those shows were like 45 minutes to an hour, and now life has happened in some serious ways. So I think this is probably the way it will stay. But welcome back. Now, before we get going on the show proper, as we record, this is Sunday night, and on Friday night, of course, we heard the very, very sad news of the passing of Nik Turner. So this is only 2 days old news for us. By the time this is edited and out, obviously it will be several weeks old for everybody else. But we both obviously are affected by this as much as all of our listeners must be. And there were lots of great thoughts and some tweets and some posts and some memories going around at this sad time. We both posted something of our own on our Hawkbinge Twitter feed. And Matt, can you remember what you posted?
I very rarely tweet. I leave that very much to you because there's real fans there and I don't want to come over too newbie-ish because, here be dragons on Twitter. However, I wanted to say something just because, as someone who's got into the music in a very big way, but in a much more recent way, I wanted to say something to honour this discovery that I've been on for the last couple of years, I guess. And I said, I'm very sure that Nik Turner has no idea who I am, but over the last few years, I've become very aware of who he was. And I'm very grateful for the sonic journey I've been on and continue to be on. And we got a reply from a gentleman called Colin Constantine. I think Constantine is his band. I don't think that's his surname. Anyway, he replied saying that Nik did know who both of us are. And he said, we both listened to your podcasts in the car and he really enjoyed them. It kept him smiling. So thank you, which I was massively not expecting and kind of added a whole new depth of feeling that idea that something that we have been doing, which, wouldn't have been able to have occurred if it wasn't for everything that he did during his life is something that actually got back to him. So I felt that was quite touching. And as someone who is, like I said, so new in all of this, the fact that I was able to feel like that connection was real. It's been a very real couple of days, even from someone who is, the newbie in all of this.
Absolutely. I have to say, I was very, very taken aback by Colin's reply. The thought had never crossed my mind. And it made my mind up about something. Received an email quite late on Friday asking if we at Hawkbinge were going to do anything like a tribute to Nik in some way. Whether it be an episode or something along the lines that we did with Sonic Attack or anything like that. But when I read Colin's reply, I realised actually that our tribute to Nik are the first 7 or 8 episodes of this podcast. And the beauty of it is that Nik heard our tribute to him. So really, this is our tribute to Nik Turner. And I think doing special episodes and competitions and whatnot, it starts to feel a little bit more like us than Nik. So I'm enormously happy. I would think it was enormously profound if anyone in the last couple of years of their life listened to us and it made them smile. The fact that one of those people is Nik Turner is quite moving, actually. So yes, this is our tribute, and the fabulous music and the cultural scene that he wasn't just a part of, he was a massive driver of, and all of that stuff that we talked about with the influence on punk and everything else. Just a massive testament to Nik Turner and his creativity and who he was as a person. So thank you so much, Colin, for that reply, because that definitely had a big impact on both Matt and I. So, yep, rest in peace, Nik Turner. So, in other news, Matt, what have you been up to since you got to Berlin?
I could fill a whole website with everything that I've been having to do, which has been fundamentally delaying the podcast. But I will save those anecdotes for another time, especially like maybe a more happy time when I actually get my stuff. Like the first couple of podcasts, I think I was talking to you from an empty room while I was waiting for stuff to come from San Francisco to New York, I think. So I've just got to stop doing this.
You had a big blanket over your head.
Yeah, I did. And it was really warm and crazy. So yeah, it's not that bad, but it's, it's still kind of crazy. But one thing that I was able to do actually before I left New York was I was part of, I don't know what you call it, like they call it a society, so let's call it a society. It's the New York Modular Society, which is a group of people who really like messing with, building, assembling and playing modular synthesizers. And modular synthesizers, for anyone who doesn't know, I'll keep this very brief. Normally, when you think about like an electronic keyboard, it obviously has like keys, it makes sound, it might have a filter, it might have a sequencer, it has all these things built into it. A modular synthesizer breaks all of those individual parts up into individual modules, which are like small, normally about the size of maybe an iPhone, something like that. And you put them however you want into racks and you power them up and you make them talk to each other with patch cables, which are essentially the kind of cables that you plug a CD player into a headphone with. So very conventional 3.5mm cables. But how you assemble them, the ones that you put into your case and how you wire them up completely changes the way that they work. And I was fascinated by this because, as we said before, I'm not particularly musical conventionally, but I like electronic music, and this felt like something that I could probably get my head around because you don't need a keyboard necessarily to play it. You can just fire electricity at things and see what happens. And it just so happened that one of the last shows of summer that the New York Modular Society was doing was when I was leaving, and they had a slot available. And I put my hand up after 2 years of kind of hanging out with them and learning the best I could and putting a little system together. I asked if I could go on first and play a track, and they let me. So it was my first and only New York gig that I did as a synth player. But I did a cover of Sonic Attack after we had all those conversations about what would be the best way of doing it. And we talked about, wouldn't it be great to do a contemporary one with an electronic voice? That became the basis of my idea. So I wired up a bass voice and a more conventional synthesizer voice. And I had 2 sample modules which were playing the entire Sonic Attack poem as read by the TikTok male voice and the TikTok female voice. And both of those samples went into various effects chains and filters and things that cut them up and chopped them up and made them go crazy. And I used that as the intro and then played a little bit of synth on top. And I invited our good friend Leo Vladimirsky, who plays under the moniker of Old Men Drunk and Sober, to accompany me on the guitar, which I also put through my modular synth and processed. So I felt it was as accurate to a kind of Hawkwindy thing as I could think to do, which I'll put at the end of the podcast to play us out a little bit of a clip, because I thought I was recording it, but unfortunately my recorder wiped the SD card instead of recording, which was unhelpful. But I have a little bit of it on a phone, so I'll put that at the end in case anyone wants to listen to it. And I will see if I can recreate it when all my stuff comes, so I can turn it into a little track. But for me, that drew a nice line from my never really understanding the original Sonic Attack through to having this big conversation about it, through to learning all of the different Sonic Attacks possible, and now adding my version to it has been a really nice little journey of that piece.
Outstanding. That sounds like time well spent, for sure. I haven't played any gigs of my own, but I have seen an awful lot of gigs since last we spoke. Natraxus, who are fantastic, and I definitely suggest people should look out for. Also seen the Music of Noi played in Clapham, and that was amazing. It's like 50 years on, and that was a hell of a gig. And Clapham Grand has an amazing sound to it, by the way. I hope to see more gigs there. Acid Mother's Temple were unbelievable and completely bonkers. And, of course, Porcupine Tree, who are a bit of a love for both of us, I saw on Friday night, doing a full 3-hour set. Incredible bands. Really, really amazing. So, yeah, it's definitely a big musical extravaganza for me. But one of the other bands I've seen during this time is Hawkwind, of course, because I went to Hawkfest, which was in Morecambe, and that was great fun. I went because Hawkwind had actually said that this was going to be the last Hawkfest. I don't usually do the Hawkfest because in the past they've been kind of held on farms and things, and I'm definitely a guest house and hotel kind of a guy. But this was great, and there were lots of really good bands. And there were lots of really nice people. I wore this Hawkbinge t-shirt that we put up before and met so many brilliant people, including Paul of Desert Fest shirt fame. If you're out there, hey, Paul. Andrew Kelleher, great to see you. Paul Garbutt, who's mentioned us many times, spoke to us many times, and Rebecca. Darren and Kim Everson. I'm sure you know Darren Everson. He's messaged us before. Andrew Greenwood, who I actually had the pleasure of having a drink with at Battersea Power Station, Control Room B of Quark, Strangers and Charm fame. Ian, John, Justin, Terry, and a few of us shared a taxi from Morecambe back to Lancaster because the trains, predictably, were not doing very well. And one of the people in the taxi had come over from the States to see Hawkfest, Aaron Commins, and had the amazing story that Hawkwind played at her wedding, which is quite amazing. I'm not sure what you would play. Probably wasn't the music that they walked up the aisle to, I would guess, but nevertheless, that's quite fantastic. And John Harrison, as the band was setting up to come on, John walked past and said, I'm still excited to see them 50 years after first seeing them. And I said, that's going on the podcast. And John said, I bet it doesn't. So, John, I win that bet. And they were amazing. Hawkwind was superb. They actually played 2 sets. They played a 2-hour set on the Sunday, an hour on the Saturday. They also played as technicians of Spaceship Hawkwind, which is the band plus the different people around the band, the tech people and the road crew and things like that. They played sets as well. So you definitely get your fill of Hawkwind over a weekend with these things. I bought in the band auction a tour shirt from 1970 or 71 or something, which Dave Brock had been using as a duster. Hence, I called it Silver Mr. Sheen, having dramatically overpaid for it. I have that. That's rather nice.
And of course it glides sideways through grime.
It does. It does indeed. That's exactly what it does. Interestingly, in the Q&A with the band, I stormed my way to the front and asked the band whether they would come on to the show. And a fairly nervous-looking band broadly quizzed me over what the podcast is about and how it works, asked where they would have to go to do it, and that was Dave. And they said something could be worked out. Now, there's a big difference between putting a band on the spot in front of several thousand people all applauding and actually appearing on a podcast, so no pressure. But that was quite fun. They didn't tell me to get out, call security.
Definitely maybe. That's more than we've ever had, so that's pretty cool.
Exactly that. And there was also the amazingly good news that there is another new album coming next year. So something else to look forward to. They played a couple of tracks from that. So yes, they are still going very, very strong. Talking of going very strong, we got some good news from Buzzsprout, didn't we?
Yeah, we actually got back-to-back notifications from both Buzzsprout and YouTube. So I'd like to congratulate you, Andy, on being a podcast contributor who is now in 5 figures for listenership. We've broken the 10,000 podcast downloads on more conventional streaming platforms for podcasts. And also we've hit 5,000 on YouTube. So considering YouTube was kind of a late starter, it's actually caught up massively. So That's a lot of downloads and listens, a lot of collective time wasted listening to us. So congratulations to you, and congratulations to anyone who is still with us right now and has been listening since whenever you started and has been paying attention. It's amazing considering that this was something that we kind of did with some hope, obviously, but not with expectation that it would grow and make an impact with people. So it is something that always motivates us. And while numbers aren't everything, this one is a nice one.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for coming along for the ride. Definitely we would still do it probably to an empty room, but it's very gratifying to know that there are people out there actually downloading and listening to us, so thank you for that. And you received something else through the post, didn't you, Matt? I received mine a few weeks ago, but yours has only just turned up.
Yes, the box of bubbles has arrived, and what a thing it is. Honestly, it sounded like it was going to be good just because of the people behind it. But when you actually get it and you open it and you get that lovely new book smell, it was fantastic. Not only to really see a lot of the Hawkwind stuff in full print, because to be honest, when I'm doing research, you don't really see it in detail. So seeing the logbook when you gave me that for Christmas, that was amazing to actually see it in full print and even not just a scan. And to see all these things in such great glossy loveliness, it does look like it's been a real labour of love, and it's printed fantastically, and it's got a whole bunch of extra cool stuff with it, so it's definitely one that's going to sit pride of place on a bookshelf or on a coffee table for sure.
Absolutely. I love the tarot deck in there. It's my favourite thing. Very, very cool. So, in amongst all the gigs and the flights and the books and everything else that's been going on, what has been on the Matt Longstaff turntable? Do you even have your turntable?
No, I'm completely lying, unfortunately. Although I do have both these things on vinyl, but no, this is an imaginary turntable for me right now. But they will be the first things as soon as they arrive. Two things that will definitely be going on them right away are two things which had very large anniversaries this month. The first one is the Artificial Intelligence album from Warp Records had its 30th anniversary, originally released in 1992. It was an album that arguably changed the course of modern electronic music and really put Warp, the record label, on the map as a real tastemakers label. It absolutely catapulted them into this realm. It introduced a lot of then burgeoning and flourishing electronic producers, but it kind of became a Who's Going to Be Who album filled with stars like Autechre is on it, The Black Dog is on it, B12 is on it, Richie Hawtin is on it, Speedy J is on it, even Richard James is on it, who is actually called the Dice Man on this album, but will go on to become the infamous Aphex Twin. They've just packed up all these guys doing that kind of like blissed out, coming back from the club, Sunday morning tracks. And it's really hard to find one that really represents the compilation as a whole, but I've gone for Loving You Live by Dr. Alex Patterson, as it's one of the first times I'd ever really experienced real electronic ambient music. There's a real choppy choir vocal, which is mixed in with these field recordings of waves hitting a shore, and it creates this very classic atmosphere. But back when I heard it, there was nothing like it, and it remains a very moving experience whenever I hear it. It kind of sounds like if the massage parlour or incense shop wanted to turn their vibe up to 11, then they could play this and still keep on theme whilst also being like very trippy and weird. So yes, my contribution for what I think is actually the first outing for Volume 5 of the Hawkbinge sessions is going to be Dr. Alex Peterson, Loving You Live on the Artificial Intelligence LP on Warp Records.
Outstanding. Definitely sounds like one to check out when we publish Volume 5, which will probably be in about 3 months' time, I should think.
Something like that, yeah. But what's going to be your first addition to it?
Well, another band that I've seen in the interim is White Hills. Saw them at a very cool little Brighton venue called The Green Door. Just so good. Kind of a fuzz rock, space rock. There was some drone. Amazing duo. There's Dave W. and Ego Sensation. And Ego Sensation played the drums, and then she played a bit of bass, and then she played a bit of guitar, and then she went back to the drums. Just incredible. And met Dave and Ego both before and after the gig. Lovely people. And Dave is obviously quite aware of us. He's retweeted us before and liked us before. Their latest album called The Revenge of Heads on Fire from this year. They had an album called Heads on Fire from 2007. And those tracks are kind of redone here, but there's also an additional load of tracks as well. Absolutely brilliant double album from Heads on Fire Industries, and the track that I will put on to Volume 5 of the Hawkbinge Sessions is This the Road?
Very cool.
Anything else for you?
Yeah, another big anniversary goes to DJ Shadow. It's the 20th anniversary of his album The Private Press, which is his second album. DJ Shadow obviously shot to fame with his first album called Introducing. It was made almost entirely from cutting up and rearranging old records, adding drum machines and other DJ gear to it. And arguably he wrote the rulebook on modern sampling, but not just sampling to make like hip hop loops. This was actually like real future music concrete. It was that whole idea of making entire new sounds and entirely new works from things that have been begged, borrowed and stolen. And when it first came out, it took everyone by storm. No one knew what to do with it. It's such a special album. I know in interviews, DJ Shadow said he doesn't even really know how he did it, and no album that he's ever done has even touched it, and I don't think he's even tried, because you'd hate to do a derivative version of it. So his stuff keeps a lot of that sampling vibe alive, but he wanted to push it in different directions. And in the second album, he really added this kind of like a bit more psych, a bit more groove, and turned it into a little bit more of almost like a recognizable format rather than this complete scrapbook. But it was very well received when it dropped. Pascal Wise from The Guardian said, DJ Shadow finds little ghosts in other people's music and sets them free, which really gave validity to sampling as an art form when people were really umming and ahhing about whether or not this was a real thing. I feel like it was a bit like when Tate Modern finally put photography into the gallery. It was like suddenly the medium was recognized, and this felt like the same kind of thing. But I was really waiting to see what he'd do for a second album. And like I said, it's kind of more groovy, a bit more playful, and also a bit more spiritual compared to this very dark and beat heavy first album that he did. And the track that I'm going to put on it is the track 6 Days, because I absolutely love that track. It's one of my favorite DJ Shadow tracks of all time, and it blends this very 70s aesthetic with a much more like 90s arrangement. So when I was listening to this like 20 years ago, I think I bought it as soon as it came out. It sounded contemporary, but also at the same time clearly was harkening back to something. The main vocals of the song are sampled from a 1971 song called The 6 Day War, which is where 6 days come from. There's riffs taken from other songs, including a 1970 song, I Cry in the Morning, by the American singer Dennis Oliveri. So it has a very clear 70s vibe because it's sampling a lot of it, but the way it's put together has this, again, very contemporary feel to it, as like drum machines are added onto it, and the effects and various noodling goes all over the top of it. That is 6 Days by DJ Shadow on the Private Press album on MCA Records, and still sounds amazing 20 years on.
Very, very good. And I know DJ Shadow was one that you were well into when we first met, so going way back. It does change what you put on, doesn't it? When it starts to get darker early. Totally changes. My second one also goes way back. Rush is a band who I like very much. Not one where I kind of have everything they've ever done and completely mad about them, but I've seen them 3 times and I've heard most of the albums. I do like Rush, but weirdly, most people I know who like Rush like the 70s 2112, Farewell to Kings, and then you get into Moving Pictures, which has got Tom Sawyer on it and all that kind of thing. There are some albums actually in the 80s that I really, really like, which tend to be my go-to with Rush. Grace Under Pressure, Power Windows, and Signals, which is the one that I'm choosing here. Signals from 1982 on Anthem. They're just very clean and concise, have really good little riffs. The songs, as the late Neil Peart would write, fantastic lyrics with a sciencey, sometimes a science fiction, futuristic kind of vibe to them. Some amazingly catchy stuff. And the track from Signals that is going on to the playlist is a track called The Weapon. So enjoy that one, Rush heads.
Sounds solid.
Solid is the word. Talking of solid, we have had a couple of solid reviews. We don't get huge numbers of reviews, so we very much welcome them when we get them. Reviews and ratings do make quite a big difference in terms of ranking, particularly on Apple and Spotify. And while we wouldn't really care too much about rankings determine how discoverable you are by new audiences, so they're actually quite important to us. We've had a couple of new ones have come in, which are great. The first one of those is from Davey Bones. Thank you so much, Davey. 5-star review. He says, the masters of the universe, an absolute must for any Hawk fan. At the helm are Captain Hood and Mr. Longstaff, so I'm Captain. That's why this is being read out, by the way. Who affirms or finds illogical as they boldly guide us past the celestial bodies of each release, elaborating on the composition and general atmosphere of each one, informing on which are safest to visit. At this current point in time and space, there will be a personal mandatory metamorphosis as I change from Andy to Matt, due to the fact that we leave the comfort of the UA-RCA solar system and push on through the late 80s Kuiper belt into the unknown. Perhaps here be monsters. There's only one way to find out, and remember, do not panic. So thanks, Davey, for that. And Matt, we have another one.
From Canada, which is amazing. Yeah, it's nice to know that this is a massively international podcast in both creation and listenership. This was a review from Fuzzy Gemma, which may or may not be anything to do with the reviewer, because the reviewer says greetings from Planet Alan. So maybe Gemma Alan Gemma, who knows? It's all chaos. Let's just go with it. This is a review 12 months after their first review. So I think this is an update, which is great, actually, because it means that someone is re-upping, which keeps our reviews much more contemporary, in terms of the algorithm finding them. So actually, that's super useful. But they say, well, it's another year into both of our journeys. I appreciate your insights even more. I too find I listened to the subject album excessively before the podcast and again after to consider Andy and Matt's points of view. Not to mention replaying earlier podcasts of, yes, I love the longer podcasts. I'm so happy you're not cutting corners to fit into a generic 45-minute box. If you discussed an album for 3 hours, I'd still listen.
Well, that could be this one.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if there's any statistics on how long podcasts are, but I know ours just started shorter just because they kind of did. But I think as well, a lot of the reasons why they're longer now is partly because we're finding still plenty to talk about, but also other people are engaging. So we're talking about what's happened. And obviously, like you said, the world's opened up again. So we've actually been able to go and do Hawkwind adjacent things. So it's just a big node of content, which is super fun.
Absolutely. I don't see them getting any shorter. We've also had people reaching out to us on the YouTube channel.
We have, yeah. I like the fact that we have both short and long comments. Like, people do leave comments on the YouTube almost like the emails, which are always fun because it's just wherever we get them, that's what they're for. There's no character limit. Someone who is, I believe, pronounced Perchiad.
Could be Percy RD.
It could be Percy RD, but I like to think it's Perchiad. Perchiad 1. And the reason I'm going to get their name wrong is because their comment is, I can't but disagree with you both on so many points, but I absolutely love this album and always have done. And that was on the original episode for us, episode 1 of Hawkwind. So if you disagree with me, then I get your name wrong. That's how this works. We had a few more going back on other podcasts. This one is from the Levitation episode, where Andrew Keelia said, this version of Motorway City always felt a bit tame compared to the live 79 version. Although it had Ginger's technical style, it certainly missed the power of Simon King. Always felt the live version could not be bettered, which I think is probably fair. I think of all the things that Live 79 did, which I found problematic, certainly Motorway City was not one of them. And I think, as you said, that's one that has warmed itself to you more now compared to when you first listened to it.
Absolutely. And that is the same Andrew Keeler, who I met at Hawkfest. So thanks for the comment, Andrew.
Another one on the Church of Hawkwind episode from Jean-Marc Young-Saletz. I believe I said that wrong. He said he's gradually catching up and really enjoying all the insights, chat and analysis, and said a whole bunch of stuff about his Church of Hawkwind experience. But at the end, he said that nuclear drive has always bugged me, so much so that I recorded my own version and a homemade video in which Lemmy is the one taken up to a spaceship where he meets Brock, receives his base, then returns back to Earth to lead a hippie convoy to Glastonbury tour. Over the playout is a reimagined found record of a Hawkology debate about some of the issues the song raises to me. It's a bit of a parody, but he linked the Vimeo, so I'll make sure that is linked in our show notes and also on the YouTube version of this, so anyone who wants to go and check out a new version of Nuclear Drive is very welcome to do so. Going back to Levitation again, there was a little bit of back and forth between, I think, myself and a Dominic Sean McCann, who kind of reviewed our review by saying, wow, geopolitics, SIOP, strategic planning, you don't get that in Melody Maker. Gonna do Earth Ritual preview before our Elric? Thanks. to which I had to go and find out what SIOP is, and that's the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, which is kind of like a semi-fictitious thing about how architecture warps your brain and that kind of stuff. And I replied saying, I don't really know what's going on with our schedule because I just listen to the thing and we'll see what we can do. And he replied saying, well, it's only an EP, but it's close to my heart because it was my first purchase and first tour. Atomhenge bunged it on Chronicles, which worked quite nicely in another mini era with Flickknife. And we're going to do a little Earth Ritual though, Andy, right?
We are. Matt listens to what I tell him to listen to, basically, is how this works.
Earth Ritual was one of these things. However, I didn't know that I was supposed to be listening to it when I did that reply. So I'm hoping, Dominic, if you're listening, that what you're about to hear makes up for me terrorizing you accidentally via the medium of YouTube.
So I've got another one, Matt, and that is from our Choose Your Masks episode where you had questioned the spelling of masks, preferring it with a K and not really being in tune with the masks with a Q. And I pointed out that a mask with a Q is like a masquerade. And obviously I announce the dropping of a new episode on the many Facebook groups for Hawkwind. And none other than the Right Honourable Mr. Michael Moorcock himself replied to chime in on this. He said, Dave changed my title from Masks with a K to Masks with a Q and somewhat altered the meaning. Choose Your Masks has a very different meaning, as in my song, than Masks with a Q, as in Ball Mask, a fancy dress dance, Mask of the Red Death. Still has meaning, but more blurred in this context. So a good little chip in there from Michael. Thank you so much for that, if you're listening. Clarifies things a little. The original title was Masked with a K, which is how you wanted it to be.
Exactly. I feel vindicated by an author, so that's amazing. I'm just very happy that we didn't get a deluge of people explaining that in the same way that they did about how quarks are. So I didn't need another one of those of things that everyone has to rush to educate me on. But that sounds great. Great vindication on that one.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And to close out the mailbag, Andy, I would like to say hi to someone who emailed us, which is Tino DPC from Belgium. He immediately started by thanking us for a great pod, which again means I read the rest of the email. He said he thoroughly enjoyed listening to it, mostly when he's driving by himself, because he actually has a food truck. And he said a lot of the time people can't come to him because events still being cancelled and, you know, like the way the world is. So he actually drives to people instead and is basically becomes like a giant food courier. And he says these 6 to 8 hour journeys have been alleviated by Hawkwind and Binge, which I feel could be the new Netflix and chill. Who knows? He also said at the end, it's about time he gets his first listen to Chronicles of the Black Sword in, as you're gearing up to record and release this next one once again. Cheers and space on. So, Tino, I hope you've been enjoying the album, and we're going to crack into that about now, right, Andy?
Almost, because we actually face our first multi-year gap between albums. It might feel like there's a multi-year gap between podcast episodes, but in this case, we have a little bit of catching up to do on the band. Because, of course, Choose Your Masks is released in 1982 and Chronicle of the Black Sword is released in 1985. And if a week is a long time in politics, 3 years is an eternity in the life of Hawkwind. And several things happen. So, Nik, of course, who we've mentioned, he does play at Stonehenge in 82, but he wasn't on the Choose Your Masks album. He does tour it for the next 2 years, though. And he therefore appears on one side of the album Zones, where there are live tracks from the Choose Your Masks tour. And he's on sides 3 and 4 of the live album This Is Hawkwind Do Not Panic, where songs are taken from Stonehenge in 84. But he is not part of the Earth Ritual EP, which was mentioned earlier in some of our posts. And it's something that Hawkwind record in 83 and drop in March of 84. Now, Hawkwind have a strong Spinal Tap element with the drummers during this period. As they run through them at pace, they try Andy Anderson, who dies in a bizarre gardening accident before joining The Cure. John Clark, who was in the Lloyd Langton group, he chokes on vomit, although not his vomit, obviously. He chokes on somebody else's vomit. We'll never know who because you can't dust for vomit. He's not suitable. Rob Heaton, who was the drum tech, He explodes on stage before joining New Model Army, or even maybe forming New Model Army. I'm not entirely sure. Someone called Rick Martinez played on tour before he also explodes on stage and is replaced by Clive Deemer. So not that long to run through that many drummers. But when they record the Earth Ritual EP, it is John Clark and Rob Heaton, who play on Dragons and Fables and Green Finned Demon respectively. And on the track Night of the Hawks, there is no drummer because that is a drum loop. But there is no bass loop because the one and only Lemmy is playing the bass on Night of the Hawks. Yes, he recorded with the band once more. The other members of the band at that point are, of course, Dave Brock on guitar, Harvey Bainbridge, bass and keyboards, and Hugh Lloyd Langton on guitar. So we're not going to dissect this really track by track, but we are going to have a bit of a chat about it, Matt, because you've given this a listen.
Yeah, the overall, this EP doesn't set you up for the new album much. You know, I think it's very much them still experimenting and doing their own thing. I find there's few parallels to draw, not in the same way that some of the things from Church, you could see them taking on it in some way. This didn't feel like an experiment. It just felt like new stuff. Maybe Green Fin Demon is the closest I feel to a clue as to what the album will hold because of some of those sound effects they use. This kind of like cool depth charge thing that they throw over the top of it. That's a really cool bit of sound effects, which finds itself onto the album as well. Maybe the last track would be more of a warning than a preview that Hawkwind are sounding more of the time than ever before. For me, Dragons and Fables is, to just dive into tracks, for example, I think that track is perfectly well done, but because it's so well done and sounds like it is, it immediately falls into the dismiss as generic 80s rock in my brain, and I find it hard to really engage with it. You know, like if this was playing at a bar and you told me this was Hawkwind, I almost certainly wouldn't believe you. It's oddly unremarkable because of how well it's put together. You know, everything is arranged nicely, the mix is solid, the expected instruments are all there. There's just no real soul in it that I would expect from Hawkwind. So the first time I listened to this and listened to Dragons and Fables, I thought, oh no, this might be the first time that Hawkwind fought the 80s production monster and lost. But there's definitely some other things to be excited about. I think Night of the Hawks, I always feel like it's off to a bad start whenever I listen to it because Brock sounds really bored or tired when he starts. He goes from like speaking to singing, so you feel over the course of the first verse he gradually gets into it, but it always starts the EP on a very odd note where you just feel like, well, if you're not very enthused with it, it's going to be hard for me to do. It also ends very strangely, which I think unfortunately carries on into the album itself, which will be something that we talk about, I'm sure. But Greenfin Demon, I really like. I think it's mystic, groovy, atmospheric. Personally, I'd have put the vocals a little bit further back in the mix. They're very loud, and it means that when they cut out, because it's vocal, then no vocal, then vocal again, it feels like when the vocals go, the track is very quiet. So I turn it up again, and then the vocals come in, and I get blasted because it's not doesn't seem like it's mixed down particularly well. But that like echolocation sound is really cool, like the same one that they have in Seeking. I feel like Seeking is a slightly more refined version of this, so I can see how this transformed if that's in fact what happened. If not, fine. But I also can see that, at least in my analysis. There are some fun lyrics in it, like he knows the eightfold secret of the octopus's limbs and a seahorse for his steed. I feel like they're carrying on a theme nicely, which I enjoy it when Hawkwind have these long explorations of ideas. And there's like a fun dueling solo between the guitar and this like wailing synth that kind of reminded me of like 2001, that kind of like Dr. Dre West Coast hip hop kind of sound, which was super evocative and cool, has that nice soul to it. But I like the fact that they swap places and like have this kind of audio fight. So for me, Greenfin Demon is definitely the highlight of the whole thing. With Dream Dancers, there seems to be like 20 seconds of silence before anything happens, which is annoying because it just feels a bit of an energy killer, considering the Night of the Hawks is so slow to get going. Then you hit Greenfin Demon, you get into it, then you have this dip in energy again. I feel like it's not wonderful for the continuation of energy. But then this bass synth voice comes in and it's dirty and round and big and lovely, and I really love how that sounds. And there's this little trill, it's bright and dances around in a high range and it complements the bass really nicely. So, you know, there's something there. I'm not quite sure if this is ever finished in my brain, but I feel like this is some nice synth programming. There's a weird chant in it which almost sounds off time. I feel like it really crashes with the synth and it kind of ruins everything because I can't make the loops of the synth gel with this chant, and that really doesn't help. help me. So again, this track is an annoyance for me as well. I feel like it's like Night of the Hawks. It's gone as quickly as it arrives. It kind of bothers me for a bit and then leaves. So it's a bit of a disappointment. I don't really know why it's even called Dream Dancers. Dream Dancers sounds like one of those toys that, you know, like you pull the thing and it flies off and lands in the dog or something and you never see it again after you've done it once, like a little Hasbro toy or something. So, you know, yeah, everything about this I'm not too sure about. And then we get to Dragons and Fables, which, as I said, it's tarnished by the OK for the 80s stank, which it is unable to shake. So for me, this is a one-track EP, which is Greenfin Demon, which I really like.
When I got this, I liked Night of the Hawks because it was heavy, but I didn't sustain that fondness for it because it felt quite one-dimensional. And in retrospect, it's a shame that Lemmy comes back to record with the band, which is this phenomenal moment. And it's a drum machine and a bit of a one-dimensional track. You just wonder what might have been. There's a story around the whole EP because, in fact, the full name of the EP is the Earth Ritual Preview. And there were plans to do another full-on conceptual show akin to the Space Ritual, involving both Barney Bubbles and Robert Calvert, which you can imagine the conversation at the time and how amazing that could have been. They actually delay the project in order to do Chronicle of the Black Sword, and the whole thing is shelved because Robert Calvert dies in 1988, and they obviously hadn't got round to it by then. And the EP is dedicated to Barney Bubbles, who very, very sadly committed suicide just prior to its release. So what might have been regarding Lemmy re-recording with the band doing a big concept show again with Calvert and Bubbles, we will never know. But that is the story of the Earth Ritual Preview. So that is Earth Ritual, and that is the period of the band leading up to 1985. Let's put ourselves back into the musical environment of 1985. Well, first off, Hawkwind released a bunch of albums in 1985, including Bring Me the Head of Yuri Gagarin, Anthology, and a re-release of Space Ritual, as well as Chronicle of the Black Sword. So there's a lot of vinyl coming your way from Hawkwind in 85, alongside The Hounds of Love by Kate Bush. And of course, Running Up That Hill has become famous again recently through Stranger Things. Nighttime by Killing Joke, which is an album I absolutely love. Phil Collins' No Jacket Required, which is an album I do not absolutely love. The Smiths' Meat is Murder. The Breakfast Club soundtrack. Do you remember The Breakfast Club?
I do. It's annoying that Hawkwind skipped my birth year. I was 1 in 1985, so I don't remember obviously watching it then, but definitely we're now in the sphere of my actual existence.
Exactly. There you go. So, Tears for Fears, Songs for the Big Chair, Dire Straits, Brothers in Arms, that was enormous. Megadeth, Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good. Marillion, Misplaced Childhood. Motley Crue, oh my god, Motley Crue. Theatre of Pain, AC/DC released Fly on the Wall. You get Rum, Sodomy and the Lash by the Pogues, which my brother had and played a lot, and they were quite something, the Pogues. Dio, Sacred Heart, disappointing. Rush, Power Windows, like that. The Cult have Love, and that is an amazing, amazing record. Grace Jones, Slave to the Rhythm. ZZ Top released the last of their 3 kind of 80s albums on a bit of a theme, Afterburner. I think that's the 3rd one. Frank Zappa meets the Mothers of Prevention, which is a great record. Half Man, Half Biscuit, back in the DHSS. Run DMC, King of Rock. New Order released Low Life. And Clan of Zymox released their album Clan of Zymox, which is also a great name. But I do think now we're really in the era of the huge single. I always think of the 70s as albums, but it's songs that remind me of the 1980s, really. So let's look at some of the hits of 1985. No, 19 by Paul Hardcastle, that was on the charts forever. Careless Whisper by Wham. Dancing in the Street by Bowie and Jagger. Don't You Forget About Me by Simple Minds. Ebony and Ivory by McCartney and Stevie Wonder. The Heat Is On, Glenn Frey. Holding Back the Years by the god-awful Simply Red. The Smiths' How Soon Is Now, easily the best Smiths song, in my opinion. I Want to Know What Love Is by Foreigner. Kaylee by Marillion. Into the Groove and Material Girl, Madonna. These are the early days of Madonna. Jan Hammer, I think you've picked Jan Hammer for the Sessions playlist. Here's the Miami Vice theme. Money for Nothing, Dire Straits, which was everywhere. This is the height of MTV at this point. which really does place these tracks. And New England by Kirsty MacColl, amazing track. One More Night and Susudio, that great message track from Phil Collins. Private Dancer from Tina Turner. Saving All My Love for You by Whitney Houston. Some Like It Hot, The Power Station. I quite liked that, I remember. Things Can Only Get Better, Ain't That the Truth, Howard Jones. We Built This City by Starship. They built it on rock and roll, apparently. West End Girls by the Pet Shop Boys. And You Spin Me Round by Dead or Alive. So if you're not back in 1985 after hearing that little lineup, then I don't really know what I can do for you. But something else happened in 1985. Something very, very big. And one of the great musical crimes of the century was committed. In July of that year, I think, or June of that year, there is Live Aid. Hawkwind, of course, don't release Chronicle of the Black Sword until later that year, so they were available. But Hawkwind are not invited to play at Live Aid, which is just a scandal, an absolute scandal. One wonders whether Queen had something to do with Hawkwind's absence, because it's very clear to see that Queen are the major beneficiaries of Hawkwind's absence, stealing the show without that competition. So we wondered if Hawkwind had been invited to play at Live Aid at Wembley Stadium in front of 100,000, let's face it, non-Hawkwind fans, doing a 20-minute set with their current lineup. What would they have done? We batted this around a bit. Matt's got a little 4 or 5 song set, and so have I. Imagine they're coming on probably somewhere between Ultravox and Boomtown Rats, maybe 5 p.m, somewhere around there. Hawkwind enter the stage.
I would have opened with You Know You're Only Dreaming, because I feel like that's a nice way of endearing a crowd to you, because it's swirly and interesting and then drops into a jam, which I think could be a good way of getting people on board. I would then go into Dust of Time, because I feel like hopefully the crowd, there'll be lots of applause, and then you can just like drop straight into it and keep the energy high. There's a good piano breakdown in it, which I feel like Live Aid was all about the piano. So I feel like, you know, if you get the piano in there, then you're going to be good. And then I thought Spaces Deep would be a good one to go on to, because it's kind of a good crowd sing-along track. And I feel like if I was Dave, I would like to be able to have the cameras on me as I took the spotlight and, like sang to thousands and thousands of people. So I feel like that would be a good one for all concerned. And then, of course, you have to end on Silver Machine. And, you want to bring Lemmy out for that. And you want that to be a big thing, because I feel like if you didn't do Silver Machine, there'd be some kind of riot. So that was my 4 records that I would have done.
Yeah, that's interesting. Very different to my own 4 tracks, whereas I've got them starting up with Shot Down in the Night for a big kind of energetic, get people on side rocker to start with, and then carrying on in that vein with Utopia, which I put on because it's from the most recent album. You've got to stick something recent on there. And then along your lines of getting the crowd on side, I thought We Took the Wrong Steps years ago would be the breaking it down, talking issues, probably getting everybody on side culturally, given the whole famine thing that's going on. And then, like you, there is only one way to end, and that's Lemmy coming on and doing Silver Machine. So, yeah, we're going to ask through the socials what your 4-song set list for Hawkwind's long-lost Live Aid performance would have been, and how music history would have changed as a result. Imagine at the end, when they're all on stage, all lined up, and you've got, McCartney and Bono and Geldof and Bowen. You've got Dave in the middle of them all, leading them all in a sing-along of Masters of the Universe. As the sun comes down, I'd be moving. I'd be very, very moving. So yes, that was Live Aid that was plonked firmly in the middle of all of those albums and tracks. But that does lead us quite nicely up to August and September of 1985, and Hawkwind convening to record Chronicle of the Black Sword. Now, I've heard in interviews, in fact with Michael Moorcock, that Nik was quite a key part of the idea behind doing Chronicle of the Black Sword. Nevertheless, he is not part of the band at the time of the recording. And we have, obviously, Dave Brock on the guitars, Hugh Lloyd-Langton on lead guitar. We have a new drummer, so that I think that's 6 maybe mentioned in this one show. Danny Thompson. We have Alan Davey appearing to play bass guitar. He was a Hawkwind fan and Motorhead fan, and very much plays the Lemmy role, if you like. But this means Harvey Bainbridge stops playing the bass, and just plays the keys. And in Carol Clark's book, The Saga of Hawkwind, he says this: Harvey, meanwhile, was starting to like the idea of specialising in synthesizers. He says, "It was an interesting move. I think I'm a frustrated keyboard player anyway. I enjoy making noises with synthesizers. It's good fun. There's an awful lot you can do. It's another learning curve. I can remember being in Wales trying to find a synthesizer noise that we could use for the sword. I can remember Dave and myself working out routines for moving the story on when there weren't any songs." So Harvey now is just playing the keyboards. Alan Davey has come in on the bass. All of the band pretty much contribute to the songwriting for this album. Michael Moorcock writes the lyrics for Sleep of a Thousand Tears with Dave. And Zarazinia is credited to Dave and Chris Tate. And the album is released in November of 1985. And really only scratches the charts, making number 65, which is a long way down the charts from the days of even Choose Your Masks and Church of Hawkwind. Nevertheless, it actually got quite a lot of good press. So this from Sonic Assassins by the one and only Mr. Ian Abrahams. Arguably the finest Hawkwind LP of the 1980s. The Chronicle of the Black Sword found favour with the music press. David Tibet, critiquing the record in comparison to Killing Joke's Nighttime album, noted Horn of Destiny was as good as anything Jazz and the boys are producing at Joke Mansions. In Kerrang, Derek Oliver was moved to say that Song of the Swords was on par with anything on the Levitation album, and The Demise was prize-winning sound of urban spiritualism in operation. But Oliver saved his most incisive commentary for the method that the band were employing to push the envelope on their musical techniques. Hawkwind's carefully cultivated enigma works by the creation of illusion by the sharp contrast of the traditional, spiralling oscillators, with the future present, modern production techniques, fashionable ethics. Hawkwind might be a cultural institution, wrote one journalist, but their noise is so perfectly realised and empathetic that they defy unwritten rules of consumption. They are their own fashion and style. So that's heavy praise from the music press, which we're not really used to. We're much used to much more kind of scathing and dismissive press for albums that do quite well in the charts. This has gone completely the other way. It's based, of course, on the books of Elric of Melniboné by Michael Moorcock. Now, I'm pretty sure that most people out there are going to know all about this. I'm sure quite a lot of people who listen to this podcast have read all of these books. I have read all of these books, but I must confess it was a very, very long time ago. Matt has not read these books. And that's perfectly fine, because remember, the idea of the podcast is to see the impact of these albums on a fresh audience. And I think it's reasonable to expect that a new audience coming to this hasn't read the books, might read the books after, may have heard of the books. Matt did read a couple of Wikipedia pages I sent him just so he could get context for the various elements of the stories, but certainly didn't do any deep research into the books because we are a music podcast. However, in case anybody is listening who has no idea about this, Michael Moorcock wrote the Elric books, a series of novelettes in the early 1960s, and then periodically published short tales through the 60s and 70s, and then these were all put together to be novels, and then he started writing actual novels to kind of fit into the story. There is a new one coming out in December of this year called The Citadel of Forgotten Myths, which is an Elric story set quite early in his history. I really don't like fantasy, particularly as a genre. I did read Lord of the Rings just before the films came out because I realised that if I saw the films I would never read the books. I failed to read Lord of the Rings many times because I can't stand hobbits, and the first 100 pages is all hobbits. And then it's hobbits and orcs, and when you read the back of most fantasy books, there'll be goblins and orcs and elves. And if I pick up a book and it talks about a wizard's apprentice called Pug, or an orphan boy who doesn't realise he's the king, then it's lucky to go back on the shelves and not straight into the fire. Michael Moorcock does not write straight fantasy books. His books are much, much darker. Fantastic atmosphere, and very much more, I'll say, grown up. I don't know if that's right or not, but there's something very, very different about these books. These are not children's books by any means. Elric of Melniboné, the Melniboneans are evil, basically. You could describe them as kind of dark, elvish kind of things. There are dragons, and they're pretty mean. Elric is the 2428th Emperor of Melniboné, but he's very weak. He's an albino, he needs drugs to survive, he gets into some arguments, he's a bit more philosophical than most of his people. He finds a black sword called Stormbringer, which he uses to kill people. It eats their souls and feeds Elric and keeps him alive. So not exactly Aragorn right there. Brings down his own lands and people, kills his cousin, all this kind of thing. He has a companion called Moonglum, and he is one aspect in the Michael Moorcock multiverse of the Eternal Champion. So there are a series of books that Moorcock wrote about Hawkmoon, about Corum, about Ericos, and a bunch of others, and they are all aspects of the Eternal Champion on different planes of existence. There is one worth mentioning for this particular album, and that is Jerry Cornelius, who is another aspect of the Eternal Champion, and he kind of lives in almost in an Earth of the 1960s. He doesn't have a big black sword. He has a small black gun that fires needles, which should be ringing a few bells. So this is the kind of world that we're in as we come to listen to Chronicle of the Black Sword. If you haven't read these books, they are well worth it. I may even reread them myself one day, because it's time to plough in to Matt's hot take of Chronicle of the Black Sword.
So we left Hawkwind in what I thought was a pretty secure place at the end of Choose Your Masks. I was surprised that they hadn't done anything for a few years post that. That was surprising to me. I felt like they'd had a very good album, so I thought that renewed and reinvigorated from that they would get right on it. But it sounds like they were doing some things in the middle, and obviously I was also worried that Brock might end up on some unending search for a new drummer, and that would be like, the end of the band. When sometimes people just forget that one hill that they're going to die on, it just becomes this big spiraling thing. But it seems not. They have a drummer. This is great. We seem to be in a time where Moorcock's influence is really riding high again. We know that Choose Your Masks started out as a deeper concept album from him initially, and then that went away. But it feels like he's back and more in the driving seat than ever this time. So his presence is much more felt. I feel like as soon as they call their album something which is definitely linked to him, he's much more there, like The Warrior on the Edge of Time. That's clearly a reference, and it's not like we'll change it around, make it a little bit like it also belongs to the band. It almost feels like the band is somehow like, channeling this whole thing, which is perfectly fine. I think sometimes when the band is so clearly influenced by something that I don't 100% know about, I just tend to take a little bit more of a guarded view to it, because I don't want to be left out in the cold. And also I don't have time to read 20 books to understand what's going on. So it's always an interesting risk that a band takes when they're going to do something which immediately removes some of their audience, or at least will maybe not engage them at the rate that they can engage others. But I feel like the band's done a good job of making sure that the music skates on the surface of the source material and isn't dragged down into unfathomable depths that, leaves people like me not willing or able to dive in because we're going to get lost and confused. So I think that that's definitely a positive. I'm sure there are references and deep cuts in this that I haven't grasped due to me not being massively au fait with the books, but nevertheless, I found plenty to enjoy from what I've heard. And I think that's normally the band's ability to take a little bit of something that's interesting and expand it in a way which tells me a bit of the story, but doesn't say you have to feel this or you need to know this in order to do this. I don't feel like I'm trying to suddenly catch up with season 7 of a TV show that I haven't seen anything of. I'm feeling much more like, oh, this happens in the book, but we're exploring it in a musical Hawkwindian way. So I like that. So yeah, I was much more comfortable with it, despite some of the eyebrow raises of you wait 3 years and then you do a whole album based on some books. Okay, that's a risk, Hawkwind, but you do you crazy animals. In terms of the album itself, though, I think the production's super clean. I think it's probably as good as Levitation. It might even be better than Levitation in terms of the way things sound. I guess that kind of recording's been more normalized now since the start of the 80s. Studio engineers have had 5 or so years to start to integrate some of that technology into places. So I'm sure that stuff just sounds good. And again, when you talk about 80s production around this kind of time, when you talk about all those singles, they just sound like they sound, right? They sound great, but they do sound of their time. So the 80s are certainly 80s all over this decade, quite substantially by this point. And I do feel like it has homogenized Hawkwind sound a bit, or maybe they're just not quite in the same groove as they were before. But compared to some albums, the way that this album has either been mixed or produced, there's not one clear thing in a track to keep an ear out for. You know, like you have the synths in Freefall, you have the drums in Levitation, you have the vocals in Who's Gonna Win the War. You know, normally there's things which you feel like that's the dominant thing, which is going to just rise over everything else and everything else is supporting it. You could argue in some of this it's the story, but I feel like generally everything is kind of put together in a way which is a bit sedate, so I don't feel like there's one dominant thing. So that was surprising to me because I feel like that's normally part of the listening experience with Hawkwind, and it's not the same thing over the whole album, but I feel like track by track there's normally something which is the standard bearer for what that track is going to be. For better or worse, that's how they're doing. That's not so much here. This album is more substance than style, which I would say is rare for Hawkwind. Normally I feel like it's the other way around. Not to say that they're insubstantive, but I mean that like there's normally something going on stylistically which is getting me excited when I'm listening to it, and it's just not quite there in the same way. This album, I guess, is probably the safest pair of hands I've felt with in a Hawkwind album, and that's a shame in a way. You know, that's not what I want a Hawkwind album to do. I don't want it to sound safe. I don't want it to feel predictable or like other things, which is why I was saying that in that EP that maybe Hawkwind was fighting with the 80s and losing that battle a little bit. They've integrated some of the more typical trappings of the 80s metal rock into them, which I'm sure was an eventuality in how they're working, but it's not quite what I was expecting. Given how well they'd fought it in the other albums, to finally hear it done, it was like, maybe that's the sound of inevitability, I'm not sure. But, you know, generally, to quote a UK government phrase, it's the strong and stable album. It's got a few things which keep it adorably lackluster, so it still feels Hawkwindy. The things that make it feel lackluster are the things which also drive me crazy about it. So it's an interesting album for me, which has a lot of interesting ideas, a lot to like about it, a few things that do really irritate me, and probably nothing that I would say carries this above some of the other things I've heard in the 80s. But generally, I would say it's a very secure album, and I've enjoyed listening to it now a lot more than when I first did, because just like I guess like all of the albums, it was a difficult one to start with actually, and I think it was this initial surprise, but once I got over that I liked it more. But I also feel like for me as a listener, or for me as how I like to listen to Hawkwind, I don't want to get used to it too much because I want them to be a bit more crazy, and I hope that continues going forward.
Interesting. I must admit, I was wary of your reaction to this album when we'd reached this part of the journey. And it's interesting, again, I fully expected and did receive the traditional WTF WhatsApp message on your first listen. But I've learned to just smile at those and then wait for the journey to kind of run its course.
That's now just an indication that I've started, because there's always like a bit of a breather between shipping the last episode and me just taking like a second to purge my brain of everything before we start again. And so yes, normally I do text you when I'm like, right, I'm ready for this, and then I listen to it and I go, I wasn't ready for this.
This is a really interesting one for me because this is the first current Hawkwind album that I ever bought. I think it had been out for about a year by the time I got it. I think I was sixth form at school or somewhere around there. Now, I already had Hall of the Mountain Grill because my brother had bought that for me. So I had a Hawkwind album. I kind of knew who they were. I may have even had another one. I'm not sure. You know how you can remember lots of things you did, but you can't always remember the order in which you did them. I don't know whether I'd read the books and got the album as a result, or whether I got the album and then read the books. But at the time, there was a strong D&D computer studies thing at school. It was very much of the time. So Chronicle of the Black Sword was a heavy rock album by a band that I had an album by on a subject I knew. So I got it on that basis. But because all we had to go on was basically Kerrang, it was about a year before I actually bought it. And I played it a lot. I mean, I would have played it to death. I definitely was a time in my life where if I liked an album, I would play it morning, noon and night until the magic wore off, if you know what I mean. A bit like stuffing your face with so much chocolate that eventually you just don't ever want to eat chocolate again. I was a bit like that with these albums, which means I played it a huge amount and loved it. But then when I'd stopped playing it, I'd kind of done it. So it's not an album I've gone back to and back to and back to and back to. And when I did come back to it, to listen to it for this podcast, I kind of had to learn to get into it all over again. It's so different, I think, from what we've heard before. And weirdly, I almost had to do what you've done and kind of learn my way back into this album. So it's been an interesting journey for me as well. I did see the tour later on, and we will get into all those stories and more when we do the Live Chronicles special, which will follow this podcast. So with that, Matt, I think we should dive into the album, which begins with the Song of the Swords.
And the Song of the Swords is a track which begins twice by my count. We start firstly with this strange kind of robotic breathing synth sound effects loop, which for me immediately conjured up ideas of maybe like an alien creature's cry or some kind of bioorganic machine working on something. But then suddenly a guitar riser fades up around the 15-second mark, and then we throw all that initial sound out of the window and get back to the tracks. So it's like, okay, well, I don't know what that was or why you decided to do that, but you did. And so here we go. WTF part 1, 15 seconds in. But intro number 2 immediately says, look, we found a drummer we like. Gets immediately into a very strong kick build with this very animated guitar riff and low bass growl to it. And you know, we're off to the races. It has a kind of levitation style eagerness to get us into the track. And I feel like despite it being a very driving track with all the instrumentation, it's actually a very lyrical forward track, telling a story about what seems to be like a sentient sword or a sword that has power way beyond its physical shape. I think that's a nice way of doing it. It feels immediately very sure of itself, which again allowed me, despite this strange false start that I feel like it has, when it gets into the track, it feels very secure. And it's like, no, we're going to tell you something. And it's all very driving. And the singing in this is interesting because it's got two types of singing in it. And I feel like this is actually something which carries across a lot of the tracks on this album, is that for me, I really like the choruses on almost everything. The actual verses I can go either way on, but they've really nailed the choruses on this album. This is a very chorusy album in a great way. Whoever's singing it is just the right side of over theatricality. You know,
it's
like
Dave.
It is Dave. That's really interesting because I wouldn't have clocked that. I thought it was someone else. That's really interesting because it doesn't come in sung. It comes in this kind of performative, not spoken, not shouted, but it's very difficult to describe exactly how it's performed, but it does feel performed, you know. And again, when you talk about fantasy and then performance, you fall into that kind of like, he's behind you kind of thing, which, you know, I cannot stand and will not have in my brain. So you know, so that always made me a bit tentative. But I just like Warrior, they deal with it in their way, which doesn't drag you down into that, which is great. So this for me is a bit performative, but in a way which is very different, but certainly very out there. It's nowhere near Flying Doctor level of craziness, but it's more animated than just sung. But it goes from this strange delivery through to singing, through to this call and response in the chorus, which I actually really love. The chorus is fantastic with the use of paradise, I think is really cool. I do enjoy singing along to that part or mouthing along while I'm listening to it. I love the way that they cut up paradise. They go paradise, but then they kind of go paradise, then they go paradise. So even though they're saying the same thing, the fact that they cut it up differently to the music actually keeps that animated, even though it's quite repetitious. So that kind of thing is great. And that's Brock clearly doing Paradise. So he's singing with himself, which I didn't get. That's crazy. I thought he was just there in the background shouting Paradise while someone else was taking center stage. So that's interesting. I never clocked that in my whole time of listening. So that's super interesting. I think the lyrics overall are actually a little basic. The first time I heard it, I felt like I could immediately guess what the rhymes were going to be. You know, we have fears and tears, choice and voice, ends and friends. I'm pretty sure when I first listened to it, because the lines have a big pause in them as they fit with the arrangement of the piece, I had plenty of time to say, I bet it's going to be this. And then it was, which is always slightly unsatisfying. But musically, this made me feel happy in terms of what they were doing. Like I said, it's very solid. The guitar and synth fills post-chorus are very satisfying. There's a really nice use of the drum when they just hit out the notes, bam, 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 and then you get the bass hitting all together. That's a very nice way of bringing everything together. This isn't the last time that they do a chorus with then a little instrumental fiddle and then back into the verse. And I think that works really nicely for the whole piece. I love the choruses. I love then the little musical treat you get after that, and then this kind of drum fill, and then we're back into it again. So yeah, I like it as a track. I like the hit everything at once thing. I feel like the drums are very driving. The drums themselves are a little basic in terms of it's pretty much kick snare, but it keeps it at a pace. So I think it's a pretty decent first 15 seconds of confusingness notwithstanding.
Cool. Sound the Matt likes first track on an album, Klaxon. It's pretty strong. I like the riff. I like the little growly synth thing that opens it all up. That kind of feels like almost the signature Chronicle of the Black Sword sound effect, because we hear it a little bit later on as well. And then that riff is strong. I quite like Manic Dave voice, that shouty Dave. It's good. It's a good rocker to start with a decent riff. You say nice chorus, gets things underway well. Yeah, definitely strong introduction to the whole thing. Not something spectacular that I would put on a personal best of Hawkwind, but definitely as an opener, as a statement of intent and a launch into the whole thing. Yeah, very well done. Very well done indeed. And then we get a little piece of synthesizer with Shade Gate.
Yes. I think the first track sets this album up to be a lot of fun. And then I fall victim to one of the dirtiest Hawkwind tricks that I've ever experienced. It's possible for very, very different reasons that I hate this track more than any other track that we've ever discussed in the history of reviewing Hawkwind tracks. And it's not its fault. I blame whoever decided to end the track with the last 5 seconds of this, because I really like the track, but the ending is beyond infuriating. The first time this track ended, when I was listening to it, I almost threw my phone against a wall. I was so mad at it. I was absolutely apoplectic about what the hell I had just listened to. So let's back up. Hawkwind have been playing with synths for a really long time, but their output has always been unpredictable. For every Chronoglide Skyway, we've had a Void City, for example. And those are things where I feel like I like the fact that they're playing with it. Your mileage may vary with actually what we get out of it. And this time, it really feels like they're nailing it. The track starts beautifully. It's rich, it's full, it's atmospheric. They've managed to make little synth trills which sound like bird calls, which are really hard to do. I've tried. So I was in admiration of how they've been able to do that. It just sounds really nice. And again, the recording that they've got really picks out all the qualities of their synthesizers. So it's a beautiful, rich sound. And then you have these glistening notes that work with this low bass hum that starts to, for me, immediately paints this picture of like a golden sunrise over this alien forest or something. I immediately felt within the first couple of seconds that I was in this place. I also felt like Hawkwind really show a lot of restraint in how they layer things in this. It's very simple, but it's really hard to do nicely, like really nicely, to really like let yourself get absorbed in this. And there's this really simple little central loop, but it's got lots of character to it. It just sits really nicely in the mid-range. And this very signy bass tone adding this ballast without taking over anything is just giving you that substance, that kind of strata at the bottom. And on the top, you've got this, it's either another synth or it's like a slow guitar solo, which fades in and out, and they give each other plenty of space, but they're adding interest. The way they even fade, it's really delicate, so it doesn't ruin the experience. And then close to 2 minutes in, when we've established our sonic bed, the lead synth says, I'll take it from here. And it starts to wander around through the world it's created. And you walk along with it. You feel like you're guided by the confidence of the playing. And the whole thing starts to sound like an album that I discovered maybe like 4 or 5 years ago called Kosmische Läufer, which was a 1972 album created by an artist called Martin Zeneknetti, who was the composer for the East German Olympic program. And he created an album for Olympians to practice to, and it was supposed to give them confidence and focus. And it's an amazing album, and it all sounds like this. So to hear this, I felt really impressed with what Hawkwind was doing. So I'm sitting there feeling massively impressed with this band who, after 14 albums, have made a synth track which I would be really happy to describe as perfect. I was feeling like a proud parent watching their child do a piano recital to their class, you know? And I'm really proud right up until the last 5 seconds where, to continue this metaphor, my child suddenly sets a piano on fire and jumps through a plate glass window. And the reason why I feel like that is because at the end of the track, for absolutely no reason, they just end it out of nowhere with a completely incongruous instrument, which we've not heard before, playing a note which we haven't heard in the entire thing, possibly in a different key, with some kind of ratchety percussion thing as well, which just goes over the whole thing and just completely destroys everything that they've built for the entire few minutes which they've been building. So it really was, for me, an audio slap in the face. I was furious, and I don't understand what possessed them to end it like that, because you could have ended it so many different ways. In fact, what I did halfway through listening to this on repeat and just feeling like I can't do this anymore, I couldn't enjoy this track at all because I was watching the play bar, because I know at some point this happens and I need to be ready for it. So eventually what I did was I downloaded this track, put it into an audio software thing, cut that bit off, just faded it out, and then re-uploaded it and made my own versions.
I didn't know you'd done that, but in my head I was just about to ask you if you had, because it was the kind of thing I could imagine you doing.
Yeah, I had, because I needed to enjoy it. I can't have 1% awfulness ruining a 99% perfect track. So yeah, I did my own Matt Longstaff edit of this and improved it greatly, and Hawkwind welcome for that. Yeah, so I don't know why they did it. For me, it's absolutely nonsensical. I feel like it's almost that, I don't know what the name of it is, but you know, there's that kind of like problem that high-powered business people get where they're like scared of success and they'll do something to ruin something that's going really well for them.
Oh, self-sabotage, yeah.
This for me is audio self-sabotage, where like they've done something really nicely and they're unable to just let people enjoy it. They have to do something at the end to just ruin it. And it's not even like a disappointing fade out. It's not even like they could have closed it well. It's an absolute record scratch. You know, it is a... In fact, if they'd have done that stupid sound effect of a record scratch, that would have been better than what they actually did, which was to put time and effort into how they can completely destroy this atmosphere that they've been building for these minutes. So yeah, it's amazing and absolutely exasperating, and I don't think I've ever hated the band more than listening to this track.
Your entire review of the track I agree with, apart from I don't feel anywhere near as emotional as you about that ending. I totally agree it's a duff ending, but it doesn't offend me quite as much as it offends you. I'm more just a bit of a sigh of disappointment and move on. But all of the other stuff you said about the track is nice. It could have gone on for somewhat longer. I'm quite happy drifting away with that kind of thing. So if that is Harvey just noodling away on the keyboards, I know that Alan had something to do with one or two of these synth tracks as well, I think. But yeah, I really like where it's going. Not quite how it ends, but I won't be setting fire to anything just yet. But I do hear where you're coming from. And perhaps this type of music is probably closer to your heart than mine, shall we say. When people do this badly, it offends you more than it offends me. I recognise that it's not the greatest, but the rest of the track I really like. The Seeking, which is Hugh Lloyd Langton's track that he sings, our hero Elric is drowning and remembers some ancient Melnibonean chants or whatever to summon the Seeking, who I believe is called Strasha. The books are about 10 feet away from me, but I haven't looked them up. So if I've got that right, then huge kudos to me. And if I've got it wrong, then do not tweet or email to correct me. But nice heavy track, Matt.
Yeah, you know, it puts us back into the vibe of the Song of the Swords in terms of it being another solid atmospheric rock track. I think this one's better than Song of the Swords. I prefer the singing on this track. It works really nicely with the riff. It creates a really solid chorus, you know, with lots of energy and groove. Again, I'm waiting for the chorus when I listen to it. The chorus works really nicely with the riff. I think the riff is really nice in this. And the vocals give the riff lots of time to come through, which is very satisfying. You can really appreciate it. The chorus has a really good use of this sound effect, which sounds like this kind of big depth charge sonar, which goes through almost too much. You know, it almost comes through and like corrupts everything else around it. But I actually really like that. I feel like it's actually a really nice way of messing with the track in a way, because again, the riff is solid, but it's a repetitive riff. So having this thing come through and start to further distort it, I actually think that's really cool. And I wasn't sure, just because my nice speakers are in storage, stage, floating their way over from New York. I went to a friend's house and played this so I could hear it, and it still sounds like that. So it wasn't just my bad travel headphones, it's actually how it is. So I think that's a nice thought that they've done there. And they also have this really nice glittering, very subtle arpeggio in the top, which again, it's just driving the track forward, and it bounces off this cool sonar sound which rings out through the whole thing. So there's some really nice intelligent touches of the synth here, even though the guitar is obviously the driving force. The lyrics are sung nicely. They're obviously very different. It sounds like a different person, so I'm glad I was able to register that. But they're further back in the mix. It sounds like it's being sung in a fuzzy kind of way, which goes nicely with the guitar. Lyrically, I can tell it's telling a story about a character that's been cast into the sea, maybe because of some kind of naval battle or something, but he's set to drown, and he unconsciously calls out to this sea king who comes to save him so he can live to fight another day. All good. Don't mind that story at all, especially, again, as the lyrics are open enough that I can just listen to them and kind of fold them into the general sound of the track. So I'm not thinking about the lyrics much, but when I'm listening to them, I'm like, cool, that's a story about a guy who had that happen to him. That's fine. But the Sea King is a cool chorus, and again has that nice repetitiveness which goes with the riff. I like it. The only thing that slightly exasperates me is the fact that it fades out, because I'm just left thinking, why didn't you fade out the previous track, you monsters?
Particularly given that it has a nice intro. The drum filling straight into the track is a really nice entrance. Yeah, I'm with you. Of the 3 rock tracks on side 1, this was always my favourite one, and I always do like Hugh's voice. He actually wrote more songs for the album, but they didn't make it on, but they do make it into the live set. So it'll be very interesting when we get to Live Chronicles for you to hear those songs and see whether you think they should have been part of the album. But yeah, good heavy track. Not too much to add, really. I think you've done this one justice there. Good riff, good bass in it too. The submarine sounds going on throughout. Yeah, just a good solid track for the middle of the album for sure. More synthesizer now, the Pulsing Cavern, which, if you're interested, is where Elric comes upon the sword Stormbringer and his even more evil cousin Irkun, usurper to the throne, who also, I believe, wants to marry his own sister. Could be wrong about that, but I think that happens. Gets Stormbringer's twin, Mournblade, and they've run off with each other's swords. Again, just going from 35 years plus of memory there, so may have got that wrong. But that's as much of an intro as I can give you.
Fair enough. I got none of that from this, but I don't think I was supposed to. But we've gone from rock to ambience again. We're bouncing between these two things, which is an interesting way of layering the tracks. But this one, compared to the other one, which was very synth heavy, this one's actually, at least initially, centered around a guitar refrain with synths dancing around it. So it's another way of producing this kind of track. And again, I think it's Hawkwind flexing their muscles in terms of how they can make these now. They're very comfortable with them, and I really like this one as well. The synth voice has that slightly I'm lost in a Japanese anime kind of vibe to it, which takes me to like early Zeldas and Secret of Mana kind of things on the Super Nintendo, because it seemed to be the Super Nintendo was actually quite good at generating this kind of synth sound. So I guess it was used a lot. So, this takes me back to a kind of a childhood thing. And not just that, this, I know it's supposed to be the cavern pulsing, I guess, which is where you get this very rhythmic rumble, which goes with the track. But for me, it really reminds me of like train tracks. I guess the music's trying to give me this idea of exploring a cavernous place with this rhythmic pulse to it, which is obviously the pulsing, I guess. But when I listen to this, I always think about grabbing the last train home from a gig or something when it's dark and there's rain on the glass and you're just watching the landscape roll by, very peaceful, very nice. Maybe you're the only one in the carriage, or maybe you've just got the seats to yourself. But, this feels very much like a journey to me rather than a pulsing cavern. But that's just, I guess, where that rumble goes to me. It's a great bit of atmosphere. Hawkwind have done these a lot. I feel like they've got better and better at them. I think these are some of the best ones that they've done. But again, we come to the ending, and it's not ended with a mood-breaking non sequitur like Shadegate, but it still does end in a way which is confounding. Like, it goes back to the same sound as we had as the intro to the Song of the Swords. So I guess, as you're saying, like, if this is the sound of the sword going whom, that makes a bit more sense, I guess, now. But as someone who was listening to it, I was just wondering, why is this strange slowed down trampoline sound persistent through the album? But if it is actually just the sword sound, then I guess finding the sword and having that at the end makes a bit more sense. But that's something I would never have got to on my own.
No, definitely. I think without reading the books, it's just a really nice piece of synth interlude. Doesn't have any storytelling, narrative qualities to it. In the Saga of Hawkwind by Carol Clark, this very small quote from Alan Davey, the new bass player, who says, me and Harvey got stoned in rehearsals one day and just started playing this thing. Dave came in and said he liked it. He said, what's that? What's that? And here it is. So sometimes just noodling around while you're stoned in rehearsals can yield some quite good stuff. Again, I really like this, and of the many different versions of the album that gets released with different stuff added to it over the years, one that had extended versions of both of the synth tracks on this side would have been very welcome to me. Nevertheless, they aren't, so we are stuck with what we have. But yeah, nice little bit of noodling that takes us to the final track on side one, which is Elric the Enchanter, which is a Dave Brock and Alan Davey composition.
It's weird because just at the end of the Pulsing Cavern, after the whom sounds, there's this other little synth voice and chord line which starts to creep up like a tiny little sonic seedling, and you wonder whether or not that's going to be the start of the next track. But no, it's immediately stamped down by this Elric dude who completely upends that track and turns it more into one of the rocky numbers. This track is a complex one for me. Musically, it's pretty good. Lyrically, I don't care about it that much. The verses are pretty uninteresting and feel like we've gone back to that Song of the Sword's basicness in their craft. But the chorus is cool as hell and sounds great and gives me another big sing-along moment. So this one is a difficult one for me to paint with one stroke. I feel like I have to really break it down. So the verse riff on the whole feels a little basic. But like the Song of the Swords, the chorus is really cool, and the guitar jam post-chorus is also really performative and really compelling. So there is something really, really nice about it. I just think the arrangement is a little lackluster in the verse bit. It feels a bit Jack of Shadows-y, but not in the same style but just in the way it's kind of put together, and I guess the way they've tried to make a song about a character that's accessible. And they've done that to a fairly decent level. So I'm not knocking it for that really, because again, you work with what you've got and you try and tell this story. I think the opener with just singing over the drum is actually nice in terms of the way that the album's gone, because at least it's different. The song has a lot of experimentation in it, which is good. I just feel like when it then goes into the verse and the actual track happens, it's got that kind of, I know I said oddly upbeat before for Hawkwind tracks, but it sounds oddly positive and not as atmospheric as I was expecting it to be, up until a point, because then the track is kicking along for the first few minutes in this vaguely enjoyable way. And then suddenly it pulls this massive switcheroo and the drums drop into this half time and we fall into this surprising desert rock pit, which was massively welcome and hugely unexpected. And suddenly the track is a completely different thing. We've got this kind of dark side of it. The riff is heavier. We're in this kind of minor key. We've got this very sinister bass, which is creeping through the track. We've got this much more, again, deserty, screaming guitar line over this riff. And it suddenly becomes a lot more head noddy. And the drums actually... The drums throughout the whole thing have been very fast. This breaking down into half speed is oddly more intense than when it's at full speed, just because of the way everything comes together and everything is hitting those downbeats at the same time, giving you this massive head nod. It's almost that kind of proto-sludge, because sludge is about going slow and seeing what you can do in between the drum beats and letting things breathe. And this lets itself breathe really nicely. I think what it does is cool. I don't think what it does necessarily saves itself from being more than an okay track for me. And I think that's also just because the lyrics throughout this bit are a bit difficult, despite the delivery being quite nice. I do think there's a point when they say the word sorcery, which trying to get that word into the line is really complicated. And for me, never works. It always feels a bit clunky. Yes, they put the powers of his sorcery to the test. If you put his powers of magic to the test, and finally put his powers to the test or something, I feel like you could have rewritten that line fairly easily to get it working, but they obviously wanted to get sorcery in there, but it wasn't going, and they tried, and for me, it's a bit of a failure. So
yeah, it's a stiff line.
Yeah, it's kind of annoying, but I do like the bit about the drugs he takes to keep himself awake, so I forgive it to get to that bit. So yeah, this track is a journey. Despite the kind of the problems I have with it, it was almost the most comforting because it feels like a Hawkwind track insofar as it starts more experimental. It has this drop. It does a change. There's stuff in it which makes me feel like it's not falling into the trappings of some of the other things. Because even things like Seeking, which is really good and I like, it's falling into a much more predictable 80s rock, 80s metal way of arranging itself, where at least this one is messing with the set dressing in a way which I expect Hawkwind to do. So I like that it exists. I like that it's on here. It's not realised in a super satisfying way for me, but when it comes on and there's that drop halfway through it, I do always get into this feeling of like, yeah, this is good.
100%. This, as you've aptly put, is definitely a game of two halves. I don't like the first half probably as much as you do. I didn't dislike it. I just found it a little bland, maybe, a little weaker. But that drop, as you say, the second half kicks in and it's a different beast altogether. I think lyrically it suffers because it's trying too hard to tell the narrative rather than having quite a small part of a song. Like, not a lot happens in the Seeking, but they make a whole song out of it. Same with Song of the Swords. But I think with Elric the Enchanter, there's quite a lot of narrative being thrown into it. Hence, things like put his powers of sorcery to the test, which, for enough, is something I've always thought. It was almost trying too hard and needed to be stretched out over more songs, maybe. So, weirdly, when Elric the Enchanter starts, I'm always slightly meh with it until that bit in the middle when I suddenly remember what it then goes on to do and then fall into it, very much like you do. So we're very much in line, I think, with most of these tracks so far. And that second part of it, it's interesting that you refer to it as proto-sludge. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but it's interesting that so much of the power of the kind of sludge and doom comes from slowing things down, and which is kind of why we both gravitate towards it so much. So yeah, really good rolling thing going on in the second part of the track. So, yep, that is the end of side one, and not a bad side it is too. We flip over the record, and we get a track which has its lovers and its haters. Matt, we have Needle, 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 Needle Gun.
Or Kings of Speed. This is Kings of Speed revisited, I believe, and revisited in a really fun way.
Yeah, because we weren't fans of Kings of Speed.
Exactly, we weren't. And I think, again, the recording of it, the speed of it, the fact it was a bit just meh compared to the album it was on, it certainly wasn't doing itself any favours. Because it's on this album, this has some mid-70s exuberance to it, which the other tracks don't, which actually massively endears it to me in ways where Kings of Speed never would. I have a lot of fun with this. It just reminds me how much I like the 70s over the 80s still, despite everything. For me, that sense of kind of like playfulness, but also just a solid groove through it is really nice. So yeah, I think it's good. I think there's either a lot or nothing to say about this track in a way.
It's not a complex track.
No, exactly. But it also still kind of is in a way. And this is that slightly like deceptive thing where the first time I listened to it, I thought, oh yeah, that's a fun little like silly throwaway track. But more I listen to it, and I think where it is in the album even, I think it's actually quite intelligently put together. Its lyrics flip between enough detail to paint a picture, but again, not enough detail to not allow me to imagine a scenario where these lyrics make sense to me. So I can imagine this needle gun. Weirdly for me, I was thinking it was almost like a needle machine gun. There's that lyric about feel my needles tattoo your spine. I felt that must mean you shoot someone with a lot of needles. Like the end of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, where that lady has that blowpipe that can fire like 1,000 needles. And I felt like it was something more like that than something insipid and small. But, that's the beauty of imagination and what you can do when the lyrics give you something to play with but don't tell you exactly what to think, which is, one of Hawkwind's core strengths.
Indeed. I do love this track and always have done. I love the riff. It immediately makes me happy hearing those opening chords of this riff. And then the whole thing's just very bouncy and fun. I love the lyrics, with the exception of the line, "It's a vaccination joy with the ultimate death toy." Because again, they really speed to get ultimate death toy in there. You kind of get death toy
Yeah, I feel like that was just because the lyrics are delivered in that slightly overperforming way again, where you feel like they're having fun. It's almost punky, the way that they're slurring their speech a bit.
Yeah.
It's a vaccination joy with the ultimate death toy. If you hit it out from a syllable point of view, it nails it. But if you're going to then deliver it in a punky way, then yeah, it sounds sloppy. I think there is intelligence to the arrangement. They just then don't show it off by being loose with it.
No, that's totally fair. But aside from that, it's probably my favourite track. And it's such a simple one. Not overcomplicated, doesn't have huge breakdown in it or anything. It's just a riff that I find really, really catchy. And choruses and verses which are really easy to sing.
There's so much fun in the post-chorus instrumentation again, like the solos are really fun, and they do that everyone hits on the beat thing again, which bridges the post-lyrical blocks, exactly what they did on the Song of Swords, which again is just very satisfying. And that's what this track is. This track is just satisfying. For me, it's very difficult to hate it just because everything it does is all for the sake of happy and exuberance. And I think to critique it would be trying to hold it to a standard which it's not trying to hold itself to. It's just like, no, we're a fun track and just enjoy it. And like you said, bounce around, which I definitely do, and leave with a grin on your face, please. For me, it's great fun, no notes.
Absolutely.
Wouldn't change anything. The fact they even squeak in evil needle gun at the very end is always really satisfying. Just in case you didn't realize it was, they're like, no, this is not a good needle gun.
That's about right. Yeah. So yeah, let's leave that there. We both like it. So everyone else is just going to have to put up with that one. Another big change of pace, Matt. Zarazinha.
Yeah, it's another ambient breather to carry on this rock chill lasagna that we're building throughout this album.
That sounds like an album title.
It's nice to hear Brock on the mic sounding like Brock. I wrote that note before I realised that he was on the first track. But for me, he sounds like him now because he has that little, Brock twang, which is, it's nice to hear him let that out. He's not putting on a character or sounding differently. So I felt that's been kind of absent on the whole album. So it's been nice to hear that. I'm assuming that Zarazinha is a character in a story.
An Elric love interest.
Okay, cool. So I thought it could have been a place or a country. It's this is one of the things about fantasy is that when you make up a word, sometimes it's difficult to then establish. But that makes sense. I like it on the whole. The fact I didn't know what it means or really what it's about. I remember listening to plenty of proggy tracks where they're talking about stuff I have no idea about. I was listening to this kind of stuff when my dad had CDs on in the car and that kind of thing. I remember listening to like Queen songs being like, I have no idea what these references are, but I just like it. Sounds good. So perfectly fine to just roll with that. It just becomes another element to the song. And I guess because Brock's actually singing in that kind of spaces deep kind of way, I also don't mind because I can listen to the delivery and not the content and still get the feeling. The music is built around this idea that it's going to be sung. Lots of long, drawn-out, slightly phasing organ keys block out these big chord changes, which you need a vocal over the top of, otherwise it's going to be really boring. And you've got this very regular bass pluck, which is picking out the rhythm. So you built this scaffold for the lyrics to work on, and I think they do. I think Brock's singing is certainly top-notch in this one in terms of how he's delivering it. He's hitting notes, sounds good. There's also what feels like this field recording of the tide going in and out. Actually, this reference is entirely coincidental, but this is exactly the kind of thing that the electronic track from 92 that I put into the sessions playlist sounds the same thing, and that kind of field recording, which if you've got something which is as blocky as this, which is I'm playing a chord now, I'm playing a chord now, I'm playing a chord, if you add some kind of field recording over the top, it just breaks it up and adds a little bit of interest to something which otherwise could be bad repetitive rather than fun repetitive. But all of that's quite heavily processed, so it just adds that animation. And you have this little soft guitar refrain which comes in to mark the midpoint, and then we repeat one more time and we're out. I think it's kind of nice. I think, again, where it is in the album, I feel like it works. I feel like if it was live, it could be a mid-set lighters up moment with a light show around it. For me, if anything, as someone who now has listened to more Hawkwinds, it's just nice to hear Brock do this. He could have been singing about sandwiches or lobsters or anything at this point, and I would like it. I don't care if he's saying Zarazinha or not. That could be the Susu Sulia of Hawkwind if we want, but it's nice to hear the delivery, I think, personally. So I enjoy it as someone who listens to Hawkwind now. It's because that is what I've become. If someone listened to this from the jump, maybe it wouldn't be as compelling. But for me, it's nice to get one of these on an album again.
Fair. I really disliked this first time round. It's when it comes on, hold your significant other slightly tighter and your cigarette lighter in the air, and having a heart of steel, if I have one at all. Those things really rub me up the wrong way. Ballads generally, just not a ballad kind of a guy. It's a bit like Changes, the Black Sabbath piano ballad on Volume 4. I find it quite hard to get through. But at the same time, I think coming back to it now, slightly older but certainly no wiser, Dave's delivery is really strong. It's probably one of his best vocal performances. He is singing this rather than being a vocalist, if you know what I mean. It's still not my favourite on the album, but I'm nowhere near as close to skipping it as once I would have been. There was, in fact, a very, very good version of Zarazinia that he did on a tour. Fairly recently, they did a tour with an orchestra. So you get this with strings. And then I think it actually came into its own for me. So I thought it was really good on that particular tour, and it's probably my favourite way of listening to it if I was going to listen to Zarazinia. It has a lot of people who love this track, though, so fair play to them. And definitely, I'm not as disinterested in it now as I was then. I can quite happily sit through it, even though probably the ballads are not massively my thing. We reach The Demise, the aforementioned device that the press liked so much.
Yeah, this track is what I was worried the whole album might be, which is, bad radio play over theatricality, a story I don't get and can't get into, and excessive fantasy stuff. Fortunately, this is just a tiny excerpt or something, and I can happily let it happen and then move along to finish the album. It's of no use to me. The main thing I'm wondering is why it's here. You'd have thought that if this was a story-based album, this would be higher up. And also, I don't really think that we've had many of these tiny tracks from Hawkwind this close to the end of an album. Normally, they're much more in the middle or the top. So that's intriguing. But honestly, beyond that, it's not a particularly useful addition to the album, at least from my point of view.
No, totally. Because it doesn't do an awful lot musically. I actually like it, but then I know what it is, and I really just like it for the end bit with the voice of Arioch, which is who it is. Arioch is a demon, basically, and he's being summoned, and the first voice is Elric. But it doesn't add much. I kind of dig it simply because of the voice of Arioch and some of the noises going on. But yeah, just a little bit really of an intro, if nothing else, to Sleep of a Thousand Tears.
Yeah, it's intriguing that in The Demise there's this tiny sample of what sounds like another track at the very, very end. It sounds like it's been piped in, like it's Muzak or something. It's heavily filtered with no bass, and then that weird sword sound is back. And that actually this time bridges the gap between Demise and The Sleep of a Thousand Tears. So again, if that sword sound is the link, then that does make sense, I guess. Again, I don't know. I know this is something like pathologically Hawkwind, but I still find some of the ways that they do these things, I can't see that they have that many fans that, I love it when Hawkwind just cut tracks together for no reason and smash things in and out. That's my favourite thing. Don't you hate it when every other band in the world creates things with cohesiveness and vision? No, just smash things together. It's way better. I always think it's such a strange thing for them to persist with. But anyway, this track, Sleep of a Thousand Tears, I don't have a lot to say about this track. In fact, it's a track that I kind of forget that it's on the album. In fact, when I was just going through my notes, I realised I'd forgotten to write notes about it, because as soon as it's on, I just start thinking about other things. After everything we've heard on this album, this is the one which is starting to feel the most samey. And I feel like after we've had a few of these, having another one which isn't doing, it's not doing as much as Elric, to differentiate itself. So if it's just going back into this slightly predictable kind of 80s rock stuff, then it's fairly unspecial for me. I feel like the breakdown in it does something we've not heard yet, which is this kind of more scratchy, scrapey guitar string through a delay pedal, which adds a little bit of atmosphere. And when I hear that, I always prick my ears up like, oh yeah, that's kind of cool. But it's a very small highlight in what is a pretty generic rock track. The problem with it is that it's not bad in any way. It's well recorded, it's well performed, it's well sung. It just has nothing in it that sticks in my memory. And after I finish listening to it, it's completely left my brain with absolutely no impact whatsoever. It's almost impressive how little I remember it.
I, on the other hand, do like Sleep of a Thousand Tears, and always have. There's a killer live version of it on an EP that they released called Independent Days. And this is one with some of the lyrics written by Michael Moorcock. And I particularly like how this track closes. You get another of these opening pieces and then a bit of a breakdown, and then it rolls into the guitar solo at the end, which is probably my favourite guitar moment of the album. For me, the last section of this album has always been its strongest. Although there are kind of highlights in different places throughout, I found it to be quite sporadic, but it starts to really draw to a strong closing section with this one. So we definitely come at this one very differently. Strangely was not on the original live album, though they did play it live, but made it onto some of the reissues, so maybe they didn't like it that much either. We get Chaos Army next, which is another one of these tiny little interludes that serves as either an outro of one track or an intro to another, or both maybe.
Yeah, flip number 2. The only real note I have on this is that for me it sounds like 1,000 slinkies descending a wooden staircase. That is what a Chaos Army sounds like to me. But for me, I think it's an intro to the next track because this kind of Chaos Army sound persists slightly through Horn of Destiny. I kind of like that recall that you get, because otherwise by itself, it's fairly pointless, I think. But for it to make a little reprise, I kind of gave it credit for it.
That's fair.
Like it just sets itself up and then comes back later. Like, remember me? It's like, oh yeah, I do remember you.
Yep, which is what a Chaos Army should be, memorable, I think. We may as well punch straight into Horn of Destiny to close us out.
I think, and again, someone may well correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think this is the first time Hawkwind have left the longest track on the album to the very end, which I thought was an interesting move. You know, given that normally by the end of an album, it's summing up everything, or it's trying to take you somewhere because at the end you want to leave the listener with something. And I feel like this does, and I think actually it justifies its length. It's a nice track to end on. I think again it takes a lot of things we've kind of learnt and builds on them in some ways. I think it's got a better breakdown than Sleep of a Thousand Tears, but in a similar kind of way. I love the atmosphere we get from it. You know, like the drummer's finally allowed to add something more than a classic backbeat, because I feel like the drummer has been very solidly pounding along, but there isn't much imagination. You know, there's no levitation level magic in the drums until this almost feels live more. You know, like there is extra things in it that add to the drum patterns, and especially in a breakdown, that's a good time to have it because it just adds like these little like processed atmospherics. So I like the fact that the drummer's finally allowed to let loose and have a little bit of fun as well as everyone else, because everyone else has been clearly having fun around him. You have this Chaos Army sound creeping back in halfway through the breakdown, which I liked as a reference. It kind of gives that soundbite that reason to exist. And I feel like they've really finished the album at a pace. This track is pretty driving. It's pretty fast. It's one of the fastest ones on the album, if not the fastest. And the lyrics are chanted out at a clip. And while the guitar solos are more sparse in their content, there are 2 of them overlapping at once, so they work nicely to cover the audio space. And it's a rare double breakdown from Hawkwind on this track. We get to dive back down for another little percussive trill at the end, and kind of made me realise how much I was missing the imagination of the drums throughout the whole album, actually. As soon as you start to hear it, you're like, oh yeah, that's really, really cool. So yeah, sonically, it spends most of its time at okay level, and then there's one bit which I've been waiting for the entire album, and that is some kind of Moorcockian lyric or concept that I really feel I can get behind. You know, we've had plenty of these before, and I was thinking, if he's involved in this, there must be something which is going to play with my mind in a way. And I feel like the other tracks have been fun, but they haven't been profound. But this one has the lyric of the Human Banquet, which I really, really like. Because, I mean, like, the lyrics are fine throughout this track, but they're not doing that much. I wonder why the birds are homeless. I kind of feel sorry for them. But in general, you know, while this might be part of the Elric story, I feel like this track could actually be much more related to the real world, quote unquote, because this whole story of an unsatisfied sea rising more and more each year can be easily seen as a parallel for rising sea levels due to climate change. And the idea of the sea seeing our civilization as being this human banquet that the sea wants to just joyously consume, for me, is this Moorcockian idea I've been waiting the whole album to appreciate. You know, the fact that with just those two words, you can completely flip all human endeavor on its head and see that it's not a civilization to be proud of. All we've done is made this human banquet for the sea to eventually consume. That just sounds great and fills you with that completely feeling of dread and like, yeah, us versus the sea. What are we? You know, like the sea is a very simple, basic thing, but it's all consuming it and certainly can be. So the fact that it completely flipped on its head a new perspective on everything that we've done and achieved, I thought that was particularly awesome. So I'm really glad that we got that at the end. That's a great parting thought and a nice analogy for the changing world that we find ourselves in and still do, and is very much something that Hawkwind have talked about before. And I think they land that perfectly. I really like that idea. Made me sit down afterwards and really think about it. And, you know, we end on this homeless bird scream, I assume, and we're done.
It's a very powerful ending. Probably my favourite track on the album, and I think it's kind of things have been building up to this. Obviously, I know the story from the books, so I picture this fairly literally from scenes at the end of the book, rather than an allegory. But it's good that you can see it as an allegory, because that means that it's working on many levels. I love the lyrics, love the vocal meter as well. I love how those lines are delivered. Unlike some of the other songs where words have kind of been squeezed in, all of these words flow beautifully into these vocal lines. I love the rising tone of the riff, the breakdown, what's going on with the percussion while that's happening, and the kind of build up at the end. This is really strong, and I think it's better when an album finishes really strongly than when it starts really strongly and then kind of peters out. You're kind of left with a very strong apocalyptic scene, which is very Hawkwind. They're very good at these more dystopian, bleak numbers, and this is certainly one of those. So yeah, pretty much a killer way to round out the album. There is, however, another track that we need to mention before we move away from the music and onto some other things. And that is that a single from this album was released, which was Needle Gun. And the B-side was a song, I'm pretty sure, by Alan Davey, called Arioch. And Arioch, as you now know, is the name of the demon chaos lord to which Elric is kind of bound. Instrumental track. Did you get a listen to this one?
Yes, I did, and I didn't know that Arioch was a demon, but it was interesting that my main note from this was it sounded like some kind of final boss video game music.
Yeah, that's on point.
Yeah, when you're confronted by the final enemy in an exciting climactic music, I feel like if you were listening to this while fighting a demon, then that would be appropriate. It's got a lot of like drama to it, considering it's an instrumental. For me, it has that feeling of like action and combat and that kind of thing. I guess, you know, video game music in '85 certainly was more than little bleeps and bloops at this point. So, you know, but now we think about video games having like whole scores that are as good as any film or anything. So it's funny that you could lift and shift this into an action game now, and it would not be seen as incongruous in any way.
Yeah, good shout.
A bit like Space Chase.
Yes.
Not in content, but certainly a bit more like in the way of Hawkwind narrating some kind of action thing. You can almost picture it while you listen to it, which is a talent in itself. For it to be narrating scenes which only you can make up, that's cool. It paints that kind of picture in your brain in an instantaneous way. You know, like you could be the most boring person in the world, and if you heard this, I'm sure you could think of some kind of adventure you could be in.
Absolutely. It would fit kind of thematically in Levitation, that kind of world, because it's not the usual loose spaciness. It's very tight and kind of very clipped in how it goes about its business. I don't feel the touch of Brock in this one very much. But yeah, lovely instrumental music. I got it on this Independent Days EP that had some stuff from Earth Ritual and a bunch of other things on it as well. And yeah, I've always liked it. So I've always kind of gone back and listened to it whenever I have heard anything from Black Sword. I could see why it didn't make its way into the album proper, but quite a nice little extra to have. And a good contribution from Mr. Davey.
It feels like it would work well with Needle Gun. It feels more 70s and 80s in its arrangement and vibe. So I feel like those would be a nice A-B side.
Yeah, absolutely. If Hawkwind had done the theme music for Miami Vice, this would have been before they played Live Aid.
Or before they stole all the drugs from Miami Vice.
Exactly.
Ran away with them.
Exactly. So that is the music of the Chronicle of the Black Sword. We now make our way to the rather glorious cover art for Chronicle of the Black Sword, which is quite definitely bucking a trend, I think, of recent times. There are several covers that we'll need to talk about. We're now talking about the main cover for the album when it came out. So this is the beautiful blue thing taking up the whole of the front cover with the sword in the middle, the wings across, and the back cover with the two dragons and the sword in the middle and the song tracks down the side. This is by John Coulthard, who we have mentioned before on Hawkbinge. He did the black and white pencil illustrations in one of the booklets that we scanned. It was the one that was in Church of Hawkwind. It was in there in amongst some watercolours that we got the originals for. It was that story. He did all of that work, and you can definitely see that work here. He is an incredibly experienced artist who's done record sleeves and a whole bunch of other things. He also, by the way, did the cover for the book Days of the Underground by our good friend Joe Banks. And John Coulthard also has a blog which is well worth a look. It goes by the name of Fuelleton. I probably pronounced that terribly. I will spell it. It's Fueilleton. And we will put that out on the socials and on the YouTube, where he talks about a great many things, including his love of Barney Bubbles and his influences there. But he has an article about this very sleeve and the story of its creation. The article is called Chronicle of the Cursed Sleeve, which would lend you to believe that he really hates it, but that's not the case at all. The opening paragraph of this quite long essay goes like this. The Black Sword album for me has always been a combination of pleasure and disappointment. I was very pleased initially to hear that Hawkwind were writing a concept based on the Elric books, a series I'd enjoyed for many years. Cover discussions were a little more detailed than I'm used to, since this design was sketched out beforehand, then approved by Dave Brock and co. Prior to this, I'd been creating something vague after equally vague requests. Communication back then was all done via post and call box, as I didn't own a phone. So you can see already that Dave and the band are much, much more involved in the creation of this cover than we've really been thinking they had been over previous covers, where even on, say, Sonic Attack, Levitation, we thought that the back cover was a rejected front cover with different typography and everything, and we weren't keen on some of those covers, although Choose Your Mask is a bit better. And it's also the first one for John that he'd created an integrated front and back cover design. And there's a lot of really interesting things in here, in as much as he talks about everything he's put into this front cover. He's talked about, rather than doing a cover that looked like a fantasy paperback, he wanted to use a knotwork style, I'm not quite sure what that is, but some of you might, to create something that was suitably hawkish while also fitting the Elric theme. Nods back to earlier Hawk art, the winged sphere, an eye in a triangle, which kind of goes back to Barney Bubbles and his obsession with ancient Egypt. There's some things, a symbol which appeared on the cover of the Hawk Log booklet from the In Search of Space album. This is a very, very deep piece of design. He talks about the lettering on the album was hand-drawn, and in some places not very well, in letter forms based on some examples from the books of Kells and Lindisfarne. I don't know what those are either. But this is a big, big article. Mainly his disappointment appears to be with the reproduction, particularly the colours. I think there were a lot of variations in the colours of this album as it was reproduced. But the blog contains the early sketches that he did, sketches that he created that were then approved by the band. He said that the sword that he puts on there is based on a sword designed by a man called John Cawthorne, just to be confusing, from Elric Illustrations. So, yeah, it's a fascinating blog with an awful lot of information in there. He says of the sketches that they were sketches he sent to Dave Brock for approval, and which became the final artwork. Once again, I'd forgotten that so many details had changed. I still tend to work this way, keeping sketches brief and vague and then working out the final look as I go along. He says he still has the sketches for the design. So this is a huge, huge piece of work. Very, very detailed. And something of a return to form on the album cover front.
Yeah, I think if you were going to be charitable, you would say detailed. And if you're going to be uncharitable, you would say busy, I guess. It kind of depends on your personal tastes, I guess. The one thing that always gets me about this is that I can see why it would give a printer a headache. It's kind of blue on blue on blue on blue, which means that trying to get any kind of contrast from it is really difficult. In fact, even trying to find a good representation of this on the internet to even look at it, to talk about it, was really difficult because most of it is a blurry mess. To quote video games again really quick, there used to be a thing when games came in physical discs. The first attempts at anti-piracy, I remember, was that you'd put the disc in and you'd have to put a code and it would say like, row 9 and like column 3, and you'd have to put in the codes, but the codes were like black print on brown paper. So you couldn't photocopy them and give them to your friends, and that was their attempt at stopping people just making copies of discs. This, for me, looks a little bit like that. It's done in such a low contrast that I can see that trying to get a good print of it would be really difficult. That being said, there's some intricacies which I do really like. I think the tail of the twin hawks, which has this kind of, it feels like it's going back to Space Ritual a bit with these two hawks around the swords. I think the way that their, I guess, stylized tail feathers come down, but then also come around from the side and thread their way through to create this lattice. It looks like it would take a long time to draw that with the detail that it has. Even the wings have this kind of lattice through it, and that kind of is reflected in that almost, what do you call it? Is it Gaelic, or is it like, I think it begins with C, doesn't it? That kind of patterning with as we have here. It's very kind of oldie England kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of stuff is very detailed. And again, if it is hand-drawn, it certainly adds a lot of detail to it. But I feel like maybe the hawk being that intricate, with the border being that intricate, with the hand type and everything, it might be considered a lot by some people. And depending on how tired I am, I may or may not be one of those people. But I think in general, I'm favourable to it. Oh, it's Celtic, isn't it? Was the word I was looking for. Yeah. Not Gaelic, yeah. Sorry, Celtic. The Celtic is that detailing, which is definitely, prevalent through the whole thing. I just wondered, just because everything's so close to each other, it just gives me a little bit of anxiety. Everything's so close to touching each other on the front cover. I would love everything to just have a little bit more space, but potentially if you did that, then it would lessen its impact. So I'm not quite sure what I would do with it. So I think it's fine as it is, but I just feel like if there was a version 2 of this, and I know they did make other versions, which I would not have done what they did, but I would have probably just tried to minimize maybe like 1 or 2 things just to see if that would have helped us out a little bit. But generally, I think it's a nice, complex piece of work. I keep feeling it looks like it says the Chronicle of the Black Swore. I don't know why the D has an extra little bit coming off it. But no, in general, I think it's pretty cool. I like the Hawkwind. It looks very Art Nouveau or something. It's got a different style to it. I think the Black Sword looks cool. I think the sword itself looks interesting. And it's funny how this looks a bit more complete. And on the back, it looks a little bit more collagic. Not that there's a problem with that. But again, like the skull and the sword and the dragons and stuff, they're floating in a kind of spacey background. So it looks a little bit more stuck together, where the front cover looks a little bit more emblematic and therefore I guess looks a bit more like considered, despite the fact that there's obviously recurring elements. It's the same sword, it's the same eye triangle and that kind of thing from the front and the back. They do look quite different. I can see when they're put together that they share similarities, but you could almost say that if 2 artists were given that sword graphic, that eye graphic, and was told to do something, 2 different artists could get to these things. So I think it just shows probably like, John's different abilities to work in different mediums, but the back is much more printed because I guess he's trying to get over actual track information, whereas the front cover is supposed to just stand out on the shelves, and I'm sure that this would have, assuming that it was printed correctly.
Yeah, fair. And I actually love the typography, and it's the typography really that ties the front and back covers together to be one piece for me. I love the fact that there's so much references in there to like Hawkwind lore. It feels to me a bit like when Barney Bubbles was doing the artwork. He was effectively a part of the group to a certain degree. He's a creative part of the group rather than being someone the label phoned to stick an album cover together. There's been a few phoned in album covers, and this one certainly is not that, and is done by someone who has a love of the band and of the source material, which I think comes through. It is very busy, I would definitely give you that, and particularly, as you say, with those colours, and a bit of a nightmare for the printer. We saw some of those geometric shapes and lattices and things going on in the booklet, in the black and white illustrations. And we'll see more of them in another booklet coming up fairly soon. But as a piece, I think this is very striking and definitely one that I've always loved.
I do like the fact that they're still working with artists. You know, they're not doing that levitation thing where it seemed to be that they just gave it away to the label and just said, I'll figure it out or something. You know, I like when they are involved and when they're working with people who have a vision and really want to put something great on the cover.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The inner sleeve is not John Coulthard. It's by a man called Bob Walker, and it's somewhat more literal sword fantasy thing going on here, with Hawkwind in a very different typeface and albino warrior with a big sword, and a woman who I suspect is Zarazinia clinging onto his leg, which is what happens in Sword and Sorcery.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of this.
It's a bit heavy metal, and by heavy metal I mean the magazine.
No, you're right. The Hawkwind title is making a lot of itself. It looks like that kind of heavy metal stylistic thing. Yeah.
There's nothing really kind of wrong with it. It's perfectly nice. But John Coulthard said he was deliberately trying not to do something that looked like a fantasy book cover. And this, to me, looks like a fantasy book cover. Quite a nice fantasy book cover, you know, and fair play. They've got two artists to do a bunch of stuff and come up with quite a rich set of imagery. But this is much more of a fantasy book cover on an album.
Yeah, the art style leaves me a little cold. Well, you said, while there's nothing, strictly speaking, wrong with it, it looks a little A-level art or something. I don't feel like it's got that power to it that some of the other illustrations that they've ever used have. I feel like Elric looks a little flat. He looks a little amdram with his hands like that somehow.
It's not the most flattering picture of Elric, is it?
No. He also he's wearing an expression like he didn't realise there was a woman grabbing his leg until just before the picture was taken. It's like, ah!
You would run a mile from that version of Elric. The next two covers, because why they couldn't just stick with one all the time, I don't know. But if we're looking for awful pictures of Elric, then there's one on the Griffin 1994 US release. I don't know who did this, but I'm pretty sure it isn't John Coulthard. But on this one, and if you're watching the YouTube channel, then you'll see an image of this. If not, then we'll put it on the socials, obviously. But there is, how do I describe this? Hawkwind is written in red above like an oblong, which has a rather fat Elric face at the top with lots of white hair streaming out from both sides. And then a kind of a sword going right down the middle, and then Chronicle of the Black Sword in red underneath. I think this was the first version of the cover that you saw, Matt, and were very relieved when I told you this was not the original cover.
Yeah, it's garbage, isn't it? It's like Elric's really let himself go at this point. And I like the fact that the Chronicle, it's called the Chronicle of the Black Sword and the sword is red. I mean, you feel like that's the first clue.
We've gone from ghoulish zombie Elric on the inside cover by Bob Walker to, very, very wide head Elric.
It looks like it could be on the wall of a shop that sells incense and echinacea or something. You know, it just looks a little bit like it's trying to be of a style, but it's kind of like it's failing at being mystic. It's weird that they've put the sword in front of his floaty head so it looks like it's balancing on his chin perspectively. And they've added a horn for some reason. It's all kinds of nonsense.
I get the horn thematically, but it's very out of place, as everything else is on this cover. And then there's strange kind of circles just to look vaguely Celtic and mystical off to the sides. So that one's not great. The other one, which is, I believe, a Castle Music CD reissue from 2007, has Hawkwind at the top in white on a blue background and the Chronicle of the Black Sword at the bottom in white on a blue background. Both looks like kind of reproductions of John's hand-drawn lettering. But then what they've got is in a box inside, so blue cover, and then on a box inset, there is part of the front cover. And it's kind of squashed in, where if you had the JPEG of the original cover in Photoshop and you didn't scale it, you just took one side and pushed it in to squash the image to fit it in the box. So it doesn't seem to be particularly faithful. Why they didn't just use the whole of the box to put the cover on, I don't know. But this cutout from the centre of the original album does not do this justice at all. It looks very confusing.
No, and again, the colours look like they've run as well. This is almost what I was thinking about, like, instead of putting it in a box, if you just remove the extra border and just see whether or not that big hawk would breathe. I can't tell if it will or won't in this because they put it in a white box and put different Hawkwind on it. At least they tried to be faithful to the Chronicle of the Black Sword by using that kind of type. But all the artistry of the Hawkwind and the full title is gone. So this does seem a strange decision.
I'm trying to think of why you would come up with a new cover and why you wouldn't just go with the original, unless it was just they couldn't reproduce it. But they couldn't reproduce it. They've shoved half of it in there, which is very, very weird.
It's quite possible, being that small on a CD, that maybe it's nonsensical. I don't know. If I just shrink out this picture on my laptop to make it CD sized, it's not great. I think you probably get enough out of it. But again, if you're batch printing this and you're not paying too much attention to the quality of the print, I can see this bleeding, running, like I'm looking at this on a monitor which has, 300 PPI or whatever on it. It's a retina thing. So it's obviously giving me more detail than a print actually will do. So I might even try and print this out CD size and see now, just as an exercise, and I'll let you know. But yeah, I wouldn't have a lot of faith on this. I think as a hand-drawn thing that was done once or blown up to 12-inch size for a record, you can get away with it. I think making it any smaller, I'm already losing the Celtic detailing in the border.
So perhaps you're saying that, in fact, you have to have Hawkwind and Chronicle of the Black Sword in white and a blue background so that it's legible, and then they've kind of shoved the centre of the image and squeezed it in there as faithful as they could to the original, ending up with something of a halfway house version of the two.
I think they probably asked the designer, look, can you make this legible, but you've only got a day? If you gave someone a week or something, they might have been able to cut that out or re-render it make an ownable version. But I feel like Castle Music did not have the desire to do anything more than just knock it out, sadly.
That is very, very fair. So that's the cover, but that's not the end of the story, because I have a booklet. Now, I think this is the tour booklet. I now keep this booklet in with the album. I cannot remember if the booklet was in the album when I bought it, bearing in mind that I bought the album a year or so after it came out, or if I got it at the show, which was another year later. But we will do what we always do. We've photographed it and we will put it up and we will allow everybody to get hold of it and share it. The front of which has that kind of, that's a sign of chaos, by the way, that 8 arrows going all over the place thing. And then most of this is just written by hand with some photographs and sketches of the band. But there are some illustrations in here. Needle gun, for example, with the 2 giant needles, and then the gun with the woman's legs with the suspenders and the weird chart thing that look as if they're the kind of thing that John Coulthard would have done. Again, nice illustration on the Sea King. The illustrations throughout, actually, as opposed to the photographs, which are okay, but nothing special. The illustrations are pretty cool, aren't they?
Yeah, the Song of the Swords is really nice. There's a strange kind of moire pattern around this sword again, which I think is cool. And for Elric the Enchanter, there's this guy in this, it's not quite a pentagram, but it's kind of like, no, it's like a giant like sort of circle, which either has light coming out or teeth coming towards, depending on how you interpret the things, which I think is pretty cool.
The city on the right-hand side with the towers and things is kind of cool too.
Yeah, and it's got this nice border going around it, which again seems to be something that John's into. So yeah, I would imagine that he had his fingers on this. So yeah, there's some nice detailing and there's some real feeling of love to it.
Yeah, when you get to near the back, you've got an illustration there of Zarazinia, but then on the right-hand side, what I assume is Arioch. That's a very nice image as well. And then the back cover is the album cover, but oblong. And again, what's happened is it's been squeezed rather than scaled. But in his blog, I'm pretty sure that John Coulthard refers to this image. This was the way he wanted the album to have been reproduced. So if you're looking for what John was intending with the reproduction of the album, then the back of the tour program is it, apparently. And you can see there is much greater contrast and clarity throughout most of that image, Where the lattice is kind of surrounding the sword, it's still quite confused there, but I think a lot of that could be because they pushed the image in to fit it. But the blue background that everything sits on is much lighter, and therefore everything shows up much better against it, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and I think even if it has been stretched vertically, this arrangement of it is much more pleasing because I feel like somehow it feels less cramped, even though it probably isn't technically just with the way it works, but somehow it feels like it's breathing better. So yeah, I like this version. I mean, if this was his plan for how the album should look, then we were always going to have a problem because albums are square and you can't get someone to completely change how albums are displayed or stored.
Absolutely. So we have talked endlessly about the music and the album cover. We already know that when this was released, it only made number 65 in the charts. But we also know that the press loved this album. There are some tracks on it that some people love, some people love less, let's say. So let's find out where this album sits in the Hawkwind Fans Worldwide Facebook Top 40 Albums by Elric Newby, which, as I'm sure regular listeners will know, is a set of polls that Elric did just for people to rank the albums on a Facebook Hawkwind group that has a fairly hefty number of people on it. There's no definitive ranking of albums. It's all subjective. And when you look online, you probably find a bunch of different ones. But as a litmus test for us, it's as good as any. And we find that Chronicle of the Black Sword comes in at number 9. So it's ranked number 10. But of course, we've got Space Ritual, which is a live album. We removed that. We are in at number 9. That's pretty high, considering that Choose Your Masks, Sonic Attack, Church of Hawkwind were quite some way down. We were surprised at how far those albums were down the list. This one comes in at number 9. Surprised at that, or is this kind of where you would have expecting it to land?
For me, like I said, I think it's a safe pair of hands. It's very solid, but slightly unremarkable compared to something like Choose Your Mask, which I thought there were things on there which were much more stand out and represented the band in a much more compelling way than what we have here. But maybe people like it sometimes when Hawkwind is a little bit more working to a formula or working to something a bit more expected. I'm not sure, I guess. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with it. It's nice to have a solid album from a band that you can just put on and enjoy. But no, for me personally, this is a surprise.
I suppose it's one of those albums where, because it's quite consistent in sound and in tone, and even in, say, the start of the drumming is, as you put it, it's fairly four to the floor most of the way through. If you like that first song, you're probably going to like most of the album, and if you don't, you're probably not. Whereas the other albums we've listened to, there's been stuff you could really dislike and stuff you could really love on the same album. But this one, probably you either get that tone or you don't get that tone. Is that fair for you?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's nice to have an album which is consistent, for sure. I think that every album we've discussed, there's always been something great, but there's also something that you'd rather wasn't there. And, obviously I tend to go a little bit more deeper on things I don't like because it's a podcast and we're supposed to be reviewing things and have things to talk about. But at the same time, I think even I can forgive most of the things wrong with this album, quote unquote wrong, that I've talked about. Yeah, I think that's a fair point that you got there.
Yeah, cool. For me, coming back to this album, I found I had to get into it all over again because I really did use up all of my love for it first time round, if you like, and I haven't come back to it that often.
You had to get out of it because you wanted to get into it.
Indeed, which actually, going back to Live Aid, it would have been brilliant, wouldn't it, if somebody just gone on from Hawkwind and just said, if you want to get into it, you've got to get out for 20 minutes. Trying to get 100,000 kids to chant along, which if they had, would have been the world's creepiest moment in all of music history.
I think Geldof could have used that to his advantage. He's like, give us the money now and we'll tell him to stop.
That's probably about right. I'll tell you someone who was not keen on this album, and that is Danny Thompson, the drummer. As Carol Clark mentions in Saga of Hawkwind, he said, I didn't like it. There you go, he didn't like it. But he says, thank you. That's when the push-button drumming was all new. The engineer said, you don't have to actually play the drums. Some of it was done like that. They sampled sounds. I'd rather go to and play the drums for real. So I don't like this album very much. I think the live one, Live Chronicles, is much better, which we will find out in the next thrilling instalment. So, Matt, what are we going to put from this album into the master playlist?
It's going to be Needle Gun, isn't it?
Needle Gun.
It has to be. Yeah, it's just fun. And I want it to be a little break from the very serious 80s-ness that we've had in the playlist anyway. I think it'd be just fun just to listen to it, just be like, where the hell did that come from, if you're just listening to them all the way through. But I just still think that despite everything that's going on with this album, it is a fun little bit of punk 70s anarchicness in a sea of well-produced 80s-ness, and that, if anything, makes it remarkable. And I still think saying needle, 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 gun is actually a lot of fun. And sometimes you have to remember that music should be fun. And I'm about that right now.
I agree entirely. What will join Needle Gun to be on Volume 5 of the Hawkbinge Sessions playlist?
It's going to be Seeking, because as well as Needle Gun being like a fun, little playful track, it's also good to know that Hawkwind in the 80s is producing solid tracks, you know, like things with a good riff, steady story, great chorus. And again, this strange depth-charged submarine sound is just so oddly compelling that I feel like it has to be kept, just to remind me that adding crazy, unexpected sound effects can really change the atmosphere of a piece and really mess with something that you think is going to be fairly formulaic. So that was a good call by them and definitely worth highlighting.
An excellent choice. So we had a lot of feedback and a lot of post and a lot of chat about our previous episodes, Matt. If anybody wants to get in touch and tell us how horribly wrong we are about Chronicle of the Black Sword, how do they do that?
So we can be reached on all your favourite platforms online. We are at Hawkbinge on both Twitter and Instagram. If you want to send us something more long form on email, we are podcast@hawkbinge.space. We now have our YouTube vanity URL, which is Hawkbinge. If you put that into YouTube, you will find us and you can leave us a comment. And we're also on Spotify, of course, as a podcast, but also all our playlists are there. If you search Hawkbinge into Spotify, we're pretty much the only thing that comes up.
Cool. Well, that was a monster of a show, and there is another monster of a show coming because we're not ready to leave Michael Moorcock's Elric Multiverse just yet, as we will be doing a special on Live Chronicles with some surprises in store, and we will get that out as soon as we can. As soon as we can is generally quite a long time, but bear with us. For now, we leave you remembering all of our good friend Nik Turner, wherever he is. The wind of time is blowing through him.
Source as possible. Do not panic. Do not panic. Use your wills. It is what they are for. Small babies should be placed inside the special cocoons and should be left
These are the first signs of sonic attack. You will notice small objects, such as ornaments oscillating. You will notice vibrations in your diaphragm.
You will hear a distant hissing in your ears. You will feel dizzy. You will feel the need to vomit. There will be bleeding from orifices. There will be making in the pelvic region. You may be subject to fits of hysterical shouting or even laughter. These are all signs of your imminent sonic destruction. Your only protection is flight. If you are less than 10 years old, remain in your shelter and use your cocoon. Remember, in case of sonic attack on your district, follow these rules. If you are making work of it is imperative to bring all bodies to orgasm simultaneously. Follow these rules.
Oh yeah. Let's hear it again for Actochrome. He's DJ'd for us many times, but this is the first show he's played with New York Modular Society. And now he's leaving for Berlin. So, later, man.